There is something deeply strange buried inside the story of Sydney, Australia, not the kind of strange that shows up in history textbooks between dates and names and neat little paragraphs about colonial administration. The kind of strange that sits underneath all of that, quiet and patient, waiting for someone to look at it directly. Because when you actually look at the record, when you trace the names and the money and the land grants and the timing, something does not add up. Something never added up, and almost nobody in mainstream history has ever stopped to ask why. We are going to ask why tonight. We are going to walk through the origins of Sydney's most powerful families, the ones who shaped the city, the ones whose names still appear on streets and buildings and institutions, and we are going to ask the question that should have been asked a long time ago. Where did they actually come from? Where did the money come from? Where did the connections come from? Who were these people before they were wealthy, before they were powerful, before they were untouchable? Because when you look closely, and we are going to look very closely tonight, the answers are not what you were told. Some of these families have origins that are murky in ways that feel deliberate. Some of them have paper trails that seem to begin in the middle of the story, as if the first half was removed. Some of them rose from conditions that should have made wealth impossible, not just unlikely, but structurally, fundamentally impossible. And yet the wealth appeared anyway. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The city of Sydney was officially established in 1788. The British government planted a colony at the edge of a continent it had only recently claimed to know about, though that claim is itself worth questioning. They sent convicts, they sent soldiers, they sent administrators. They sent a man named Arthur Phillip who was supposed to organize all of these people into something resembling a functioning settlement. The early years were genuinely brutal. The soil around Sydney Cove was thin and poor. The farming failed repeatedly. People starved. Supply ships were delayed. There were years early in the colony's life where the entire population of European settlers in Australia was teetering on the edge of collapse. This was not a place of opportunity in any recognizable sense. This was a place of punishment and survival and misery for most of the people who found themselves there. And yet, within a single generation, by the early 1800s, a small collection of families had accumulated land holdings that stretched across what would eventually become the most valuable real estate in the Southern Hemisphere. They had built stone houses when everyone else was living in rough timber structures. They had extended credit networks that reached back to London and to trading houses in India and Canton. They had influence over the courts, over the licensing of trade, over the granting of land, over the administration of justice. They had, in a word, everything. And they had gotten it with a speed and a completeness that should raise questions in anyone paying attention. Let us start at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as the record allows us to get. Arthur Phillip sailed into what he named Port Jackson on the 26th of January 1788. He had with him roughly 11 ships carrying somewhere around 1,400 people, of whom more than 700 were convicts. The rest were Marines, naval officers, government officials, and a handful of what the records call free settlers, though that term is somewhat flexible. The landscape that greeted them was spectacular in ways that had nothing to do with colonial utility. Dense bush came right down to the water. The harbour was deep and sheltered. There were freshwater streams. There were fish in the bay. But the soil was not what they needed, and the people who were already living there, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, were not inclined to assist in the project of their own dispossession, which should surprise no one. From the very first days, the colony was shaped by a hierarchy that had been built into its structure before a single ship left Portsmouth. At the top was the governor, appointed by the Crown, answerable to London. Below him were the military officers of the New South Wales Corps, who would eventually become known as the Rum Corps for reasons that tell you something about how power actually operated in early Sydney. Below them were the free settlers. Below them were the emancipists, meaning convicts who had served their sentences and been released. At the bottom were the convicts who were still serving, and below even them, though the official hierarchy refused to acknowledge them as part of the hierarchy at all, were the Aboriginal people whose land this all was. The economy of early Sydney was not really an economy in any modern sense. It was a system of allocation, of rations and labour assignments and land grants decided by the governor's office. Money was scarce, actual coin was incredibly scarce, and for a time the primary medium of exchange was rum, which is a detail that should tell you something about the nature of the power structures that were forming. The people who controlled the rum controlled the commerce. The people who controlled the commerce controlled the labour. The people who controlled the labour controlled the land. And the people who controlled the land controlled everything that came after. Now, here is where we need to slow down and look very carefully. The New South Wales Corps was established specifically for service in the colony. Unlike regular British Army regiments, it recruited officers largely from men who could not get positions elsewhere. This is not a flattering description, but it is the one that historians have used, and it is accurate. The Corps was full of men who were second sons, men who had failed in business, men who had minor debts or minor scandals in England that made a posting to the end of the world seem like a reasonable option. These were not the elite of British military society. These were the leftovers, or at least that is how they have been described. And yet several of these men ended up extraordinarily wealthy. Not comfortably well off, not locally prosperous in a small colonial way, extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of their time and place. They built estates, they imported luxury goods, they entertained lavishly, they loaned money at interest and called in those loans with the confidence of men who had institutional backing. They behaved, in other words, like men who had access to capital that did not appear on any colonial ledger. Which raises the question that the history books tend to glide past rather quickly. Where did that capital come from? One of the first names you encounter when you start digging into this question is John MacArthur. If you know anything about early Australian history, you know his name. He is in the textbooks as the father of the Australian wool industry. He is credited with establishing the merino sheep breeding program that would eventually make Australia one of the most important wool-producing regions in the world. He is a founding figure, a patriarch, one of the men around whom the story of colonial New South Wales is organised. But look at John MacArthur before he was John MacArthur, the wool baron. Look at him before the sheep, before the land grants, before the influence. What do you find? He arrived in Sydney in 1790 as a lieutenant in the New South Wales Corps. He had come from a modest background in Devon. His father was a mercer, meaning a cloth merchant, who had done reasonably well but not spectacularly. John himself had debts before he left England. He had a wife, Elizabeth, who by all accounts was significantly more capable than he was. And he had a reputation for quarrelling, for duelling, for making enemies, and for refusing to back down from any conflict regardless of consequences. He was, by most accounts, a difficult and combative man who had made himself unwelcome in every room he had ever entered. And yet, within a decade of arriving in Sydney, he had land, significant land. Not the small grants given to ordinary soldiers and settlers, but grants that reflected a kind of influence that went beyond his official rank and official connections. He had a farm called Elizabeth Farm, named for his wife, that was operating profitably in ways that the surrounding farms were not. He had sheep, and not just the rough local animals that most settlers were working with. He had connections to sources of merino stock that were not available to ordinary colonists. He had borrowed money, yes, but he had also somehow acquired things that money alone could not simply purchase in a colony at the edge of the world in 1800. The standard explanation is that MacArthur was simply brilliant and energetic and far-sighted in ways that his contemporaries were not, that he saw the potential of the land and seized it with the vision of a true pioneer. This is the story the textbooks tell, but consider a few details that the textbooks tend to smooth over. In 1801, MacArthur was sent back to England under arrest. He had shot his commanding officer in a duel. He was supposed to face a court-martial. Instead, something remarkable happened. He met with officials in London, including members of the Board of Trade, and came away from those meetings not with a court-martial, but with a letter authorizing him to import merino sheep directly from the royal flocks at Kew. He returned to Sydney not as a disgraced officer, but as a man with a government mandate to develop the wool industry. He was given additional land grants to make this possible. He was, in other words, transformed during a visit to England from a man facing serious legal consequences into a man with significant official backing. How does that happen? What happened in those meetings? What was said? What was offered? The record does not tell us, at least not in any of the sources that are easily accessible. What the record tells us is the outcome. And the outcome was that a quarrelsome lieutenant from Devon, a man who had repeatedly made himself impossible in official company, came out of a London meeting with the kind of support that most men could not have obtained regardless of their behavior. That is a gap in the story, a significant gap. And John MacArthur's story is not unique among the founding families of Sydney's wealth. Consider the story of Simeon Lord. Here is a man whose origins are about as unpromising as origins can be in the late 18th century. He arrived in Sydney in 1791 as a convict, transported for stealing cloth. He was 17 years old. He was a Lancashire mill worker's son. He had nothing. No connections, no capital, no land, no family in the colony who could help him. By any reasonable projection of his life from the moment he arrived in Sydney Cove as a teenage convict, Simeon Lord should have lived out a quiet and difficult life at the margins of colonial society, perhaps eventually scratching out a living as a small trader or farmer if he was lucky. Instead, within 10 years of his arrival, Simeon Lord was one of the wealthiest men in New South Wales. He was operating a trading network that connected Sydney to the Pacific Islands, to India, to China. He was importing and exporting goods on a scale that required significant capital investment and significant credit from somewhere. He was manufacturing goods locally, had a factory producing textiles and other products. He owned property, substantial property. He loaned money to other merchants and to the colonial government itself. He was, by the standards of any port city in the early 19th century world, a genuinely significant commercial figure. How? How does a 17-year-old transported convict in a colony that is struggling to feed itself become within a decade one of the most powerful merchants in that colony? The standard answer again involves genius and initiative, and seizing opportunities that others missed. And Simeon Lord was undoubtedly capable. The record of what he built is real and cannot be dismissed. But capability does not by itself explain the trajectory. Capability requires resources. Capability requires access to credit, to information, to networks. Where did Simeon Lord's first capital come from? Who extended him the first significant credit? Who gave him the information he needed to operate effectively in markets that stretched from Sydney to Canton? The record on these questions is thin, in ways that feel, again, deliberate. There are gaps at exactly the moments where the gaps matter most. Let us go even deeper into the question of where the money came from, because to understand the founding families of Sydney's wealth, you need to understand the economic structures that made their rise possible, and those structures have their own hidden history. The colony of New South Wales was not, officially, supposed to be a commercial enterprise. It was supposed to be a penal settlement. Its purpose, in the official British accounting of the thing, was to relieve the pressure on the overcrowded prisons in England and to establish a British presence at the edge of the Pacific in case anyone else decided to claim that corner of the world. Commerce was supposed to be secondary, controlled, limited. The colony was supposed to depend on supply ships from England and on the labor of convicts working government farms. But very early, even from the first years, the official economy and the real economy were two different things. The real economy was built around the informal trade networks that the officers and administrators of the colony established for their own benefit. They controlled the allocation of convict labor, which meant they could direct that labor to their own farms and enterprises while charging the government for it. They controlled the licensing of trade, which meant they could effectively decide who could do business and on what terms. They controlled the access to rum, which, as we noted earlier, was the primary medium of exchange. And controlling the medium of exchange is one of the most powerful economic positions that exists in any society. This was the system that historians have called the rum core economy, and it was extraordinarily lucrative for the men at the top of it. But again, the question is where the initial capital came from that let some men rise to the top of this system rather than others. Because not every officer in the New South Wales Corps became wealthy. Not every free settler built an empire. Something distinguished the men who ended up on top from the men who ended up merely surviving, and that something is not entirely explained by the conventional accounts. There is a thread here that runs through multiple founding family stories, and it connects to something that the official history of colonial Australia tends to treat as a peripheral detail rather than a central fact. That thread is the China trade. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the trade routes between Britain, India, and China represented some of the most profitable commercial operations in the world. The East India Company had a nominal monopoly on much of this trade, but that monopoly was leaky in ways that created enormous opportunities for men who knew how to work in its gaps. Ships passing through Sydney on their way to and from the Pacific, trades were carrying goods whose value was almost impossible to overstate. Tea, spice, silk, opium, sandalwood, sea cucumber, which the Chinese market valued highly, pearl shell, fur seals, whale oil. The Pacific commodities trade was a world of extraordinary margins if you had access to it. Sydney, sitting at the edge of the Pacific, was positioned to be a significant node in this trade network if someone with the right connections decided to make it so. And someone, or more accurately several someones, did. The families who built Sydney's early wealth were not simply local entrepreneurs who discovered local opportunities. They were men who had connections, or who acquired connections with remarkable speed, to the networks that were moving goods across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And those connections did not come from nowhere. They came from somewhere, from people, from institutions, from relationships that were forged in spaces that are not well documented in the colonial record. This is where the story starts to get genuinely strange. Because when you trace the connections of the founding merchant families of Sydney back through the Pacific trade networks, you start encountering names and institutions that appear in the record very briefly, very specifically, and then vanish. You find reference to financial backing that came from London counting houses whose records, when you try to find them, either do not exist or are incomplete in very specific ways. You find mention of partnerships with men who are identified by their roles in the colony but whose backgrounds outside the colony are difficult to establish. You find a pattern that looks less like the ordinary chaos of incomplete historical records and more like a pattern of deliberate construction. As if the early chapters of the story were written to be sufficient for official purposes without being sufficient for actual scrutiny. We are going to follow that pattern tonight. We are going to trace it through the specific families, through the specific transactions, through the specific moments where the record goes quiet at exactly the moment you most need it to speak. And we are going to start with the land, because in colonial New South Wales, everything came back to the land. The system of land grants in early Sydney was, at least officially, relatively simple. The governor had the authority to grant land to settlers, to emancipists who had served their sentences, and to officers and free settlers who met certain criteria. The size of the grant was supposed to be calibrated to the recipient's means to develop it. You were supposed to receive land proportional to what you could actually use and improve. The system was supposed to be rational and manageable and fair. It was none of those things. From the very early years of the colony, the system was used as a tool of patronage, favoritism, and political reward in ways that had almost nothing to do with the official criteria. Governors granted large tracts of land to men who were politically useful, to men who had connections in London that the governor needed to cultivate, to men who provided services that the colony required, and sometimes to men whose qualifications seemed to consist entirely of the fact that they had asked at the right moment and been standing in the right room. The result was that by 1810, before the colony had even entered its third decade of existence, an enormous portion of the most agriculturally viable land in New South Wales was in the hands of a very small number of men and families. Land that had belonged to the Darug people, the Tharawal people, the Gundungurra people. Land that had been tended and managed by these communities for tens of thousands of years had been transferred through the fiction of crown sovereignty into private hands within a generation. And the men who held that land were, disproportionately men with murky financial backgrounds and suspiciously clear political connections. Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who governed New South Wales from 1810 to 1821, is generally credited with being the great builder and civilizer of the colony. He constructed roads and hospitals and churches. He promoted emancipists to positions of social respectability. He tried to create something that looked like a real society rather than just a penal camp, and he did all of these things. But he also presided over a period of land granting that, when you look at the numbers, raises serious questions. Under Macquarie's governorship, millions of acres were granted. A significant portion of those grants went to men who, by any objective measure, had no obvious claim on that quantity of land. The grants were large, sometimes enormously so, and they went to men who, in many cases, had already accumulated more land than they could credibly develop with their stated resources, which meant that the land itself was the resource, that the grant was not a tool of development, but a transfer of wealth from the public domain to private hands in ways that benefited a specific class of people who had access to the governor's favor. How did men get access to that favor? That is the question the records do not answer clearly. Some of it was social. Colonial Sydney was a small world, and the class of free settlers and officers and officials was a smaller world within it. Men who went to the same church, who attended the same dinners, whose wives were friendly, had natural advantages in the competition for official favor. This is boring and human and unremarkable, but it does not explain the scale of some of the grants or the speed at which some men accumulated influence that went well beyond what their official positions should have provided. There is another explanation that hovers at the edges of the historical literature without ever being directly stated, and it has to do with the nature of the information that the governor of New South Wales actually needed to do his job. Running a colony at the edge of the world in the early 19th century, with communication to London that took months in each direction, required the governor to make decisions without guidance. He needed to know which merchants were reliable, which ships were trustworthy, which trading partners in the Pacific were legitimate and which were not. He needed commercial intelligence that the official colonial apparatus could not provide, because the official apparatus barely existed. And the men who could provide that intelligence, who had connections in the Pacific trade networks, who knew which routes were open and which were dangerous, who could arrange credit in Canton or Calcutta on terms that served the colony's interests, those men had something the governor needed, and men who had something the governor needed tended to acquire land. This is a speculative explanation, and we need to be clear that it is speculative. But it fits the pattern of what actually happened better than the conventional explanation, which mostly involves references to the entrepreneurial spirit and the vision of individual founding fathers. Let us look at one more founding figure before we move into the deeper mysteries. His name was Robert Campbell, and he was, in his own time, one of the most significant commercial figures in New South Wales. He arrived in Sydney in 1798 as an agent for a Calcutta trading house. He was Scottish, from a merchant family in Greenock, and he had been sent to Sydney specifically to investigate its commercial potential as a trading point. He set up a warehouse at Sydney Cove, imported goods, facilitated the export of colonial products, and within a few years had established himself as the most important private merchant in the colony. Campbell's rise is in some ways the most transparent of the founding merchant stories, because at least the mechanism is partially visible. He had family connections in the Calcutta trading world. He had backing from established commercial interests. He was, in other words, a factor of existing capital rather than a man who materialized capital from thin air. The money behind Campbell was real and traceable, at least to a point. But even Campbell's story has its strange corners. His trading house was deeply involved in the Pacific commodities trade, including the sandalwood trade with Fiji and Tonga and the sea cucumber trade with China. These were trades that required relationships with Pacific Island communities, relationships that involved forms of exchange and negotiation that are very thinly documented in the official record. They also required relationships with the captains and crews of the vessels doing this trade, men who occupied a legal and social space that is difficult to categorize neatly. Some of them were legitimate traders. Some of them were operating in legal gray areas, that shaded into outright illegality, depending on whose legal framework you were applying. And some of them were men whose careers before they arrived in the Pacific cannot be traced with any confidence at all. Campbell knew all of these men. He did business with all of them. And some of the capital that flowed through his warehouses in Sydney came from commercial activities that the official record does not describe in detail. This is not a unique situation in the history of early colonial commerce. The line between legitimate trade and smuggling, between legal privateering and outright piracy, between authorized commerce and unauthorized commerce, was blurry in the early 19th century Pacific in ways that are difficult to appreciate from our contemporary vantage point. But it is a situation that helps explain why some of the founding wealth of Sydney looks, when you trace it carefully, like it came from sources that the historical record would prefer not to name directly. We are going to name them, or at least come as close to naming them as the evidence allows. But first, let us talk about what was actually happening in the Pacific during this period, because the world in which Sydney's founding families operated was not the clean colonial narrative that the official history presents. It was something much wilder, much stranger, and much more connected to forces and networks that we do not usually associate with the story of Australian settlement. The late 18th century Pacific was one of the most dynamic and unpredictable commercial environments in the world. The decline of Spanish power in the region, the end of the American Revolutionary War, the disruption of traditional trade routes by the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, all of these factors had combined to create a Pacific that was, from a commercial perspective, essentially open territory. The old rules were not enforced. The old monopolies were crumbling. Ships carrying goods from dozens of national origins and operating under flags of convenience were moving through the region with a freedom that would have been impossible a generation earlier. And the goods they carried, the routes they traveled, the networks they maintained, these were things that had value beyond their immediate commercial price. They were strategic assets in a world where British, French, American, and Dutch imperial interests were all pressing into the same geographic space. The man who knew where the sandalwood was, who knew which island communities would trade and on what terms, who knew which harbors were safe and which were dangerous, who knew the patterns of wind and current that made certain passages practical and others suicidal, that man had something that national governments and commercial empires would pay for. Some of the men who ended up wealthy in Sydney in the early 1800s had that kind of knowledge. And the question of how they acquired it, what they did with it, and who paid them for it, is a question that the official historical record has never answered satisfactorily. Let us now go deeper into a specific story that illustrates this pattern more concretely than any general discussion can. The story of the Wentworth family is one of the most celebrated in early Australian history. William Charles Wentworth is a figure of almost mythological status in the Australian national story. He was the great advocate of self-government for the colony. He was the man who wrote the first constitution for New South Wales. He was an explorer who crossed the Blue Mountains, which had blocked European expansion west of Sydney for the first 25 years of the colony's existence. He was a barrister, a journalist, a politician, a landowner. He was, in the Standard account, one of the founding heroes of modern Australia. His father was Darcy Wentworth, and Darcy Wentworth is one of the most interesting figures in early Australian history precisely because his story illustrates, with unusual clarity, the patterns we have been tracing. Darcy Wentworth arrived in Sydney in 1790 as a free passenger on the Neptune, one of the ships of the Second Fleet. He was an Irishman from County Armagh, who had trained as a surgeon but had found himself, before departing for New South Wales, facing trial in England on charges of highway robbery. Not once but 3 times. He was acquitted each time, but the trials had happened. He had been accused of being a highwayman, a road criminal, a man who stopped coaches and took money at gunpoint. He had beaten those charges through some combination of legal talent, witness unreliability, and what the record suggests may have been influence exerted by powerful connections in England, who found it useful to have Darcy Wentworth in a place where he could no longer cause embarrassment. He arrived in New South Wales not as a convict but as an assistant surgeon, and he proceeded to become within the first 2 decades of the 19th century, one of the largest landholders in the colony, a man with multiple estates, a man who ran the police force of New South Wales, a man who had influence that extended through every significant institution of the colonial government. His son, William Charles, would inherit both the land and the connections, and would translate them into a political career of extraordinary scope and lasting influence. How did a thrice-tried highwayman become one of the most powerful men in colonial Australia? The standard explanations involve his professional competence as a surgeon, his political intelligence, his social adaptability, his willingness to perform the functions that the colonial administration needed performed, regardless of whether those functions were entirely above board. All of this may be true now, but it does not explain the land. It does not explain the connections to London that kept Darcy Wentworth in favourable standing with successive governors, despite his criminal background and despite his repeated behaviour that other men would have been dismissed or worse for. It does not explain the ease with which he moved from accused highwayman to colonial patriarch in a time period that should have been far too short for such a transformation. Unless you consider the possibility that the transformation was not as spontaneous as it looks, unless you consider the possibility that Darcy Wentworth arrived in New South Wales with arrangements already in place, with commitments already made to people who had the power to smooth his path and who required, in return, the kind of services that a man like Darcy Wentworth, with his particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and social connections, was uniquely positioned to provide. What kind of services? That is the question we are going to spend some time with now. The British Empire in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was not a monolithic institution governed by a single unified interest. It was a collection of competing factions, rival commercial networks, overlapping intelligence operations, and personal fiefdoms that happened to operate under the same flag. The official history tends to present it as something more coherent and more purposeful than it actually was. But the men who were inside it, the men who operated within its machinery, knew it for what it was. A system that could be navigated by those who understood its actual structure rather than its official structure. The actual structure of British imperial power in this period ran through a series of institutions that were publicly known, but whose internal operations were only visible to those who were part of them. The East India Company was one. The various banking houses of the City of London were another. The Admiralty had its own networks. The Treasury had networks that did not always align with those of the Admiralty. And underneath all of these official and semi-official structures was a layer of informal networks, of men who knew each other, who trusted each other, who passed information and capital and influence through personal relationships rather than official channels, and whose power was in some ways greater than that of the official institutions, precisely because it was invisible and unaccountable. The men who built Sydney's early wealth were connected to this layer. Some of them were connected directly. Some were connected through intermediaries. But the connections were there, in the record, if you know how to read the record, and they explain things that the conventional history cannot explain. Consider the question of credit. In the early colonial period, obtaining credit was one of the most significant barriers to commercial success for most people in New South Wales. The colony had no bank until 1817. There was no formal credit market. The official currency was inadequate in quantity and irregular in availability. And yet some men were operating with credit extended on terms that implied backing from financial institutions that were not present in the colony. They were taking on commitments that required capital that they did not visibly have, and those commitments were being met. Someone was backing them. Someone with access to actual financial resources was guaranteeing, in one way or another, that certain men in Sydney could extend themselves commercially beyond what their colonial assets could support. Who? The most honest answer the historical record can give us is, we do not know with certainty. But the circumstances point in a direction, and that direction is toward the intersection of several specific networks that were operating in the Pacific during this period. One of those networks centered on the whaling industry, which was one of the most significant commercial operations in the late 18th and early 19th century Pacific. British and American whaling ships were working the Southern Ocean from the 1790s onward, and Sydney was the natural resupply and trading point for this industry. The men who controlled the shore infrastructure of the whaling trade, who could provide provisions and repairs and arrange the sale of oil, were in a position of enormous commercial leverage. And several of the founding merchant families of Sydney were deeply involved in the whaling shore trade. But the whaling industry also had a darker dimension that is rarely discussed in the standard accounts. Whaling ships were extraordinarily flexible commercial vehicles. They could carry goods as well as hunt whales. They operated in waters and at distances from any legal authority that made their activities very difficult to monitor. Some of them were involved in trades that were not entirely legal under British law, including the trade in Pacific Island labor that would eventually be formalized as the blackbirding trade, but existed informally well before that formalization. Some of them were involved in the movement of goods that had been acquired through transactions that would not have survived scrutiny by customs officials. And some of them were moving money or the equivalent of money in trade goods between parties in ways that bypassed official financial channels entirely. The men in Sydney who were connected to this industry had access to capital flows that did not appear in official ledgers, and some of those men became very wealthy in ways that the official ledgers cannot explain. This is not a claim about specific individuals committing specific crimes. The evidence does not support that level of specificity in most cases, and making accusations without evidence is not what this is about. What this is about is the structural reality of how the early colonial economy actually functioned, and how that actual functioning explains the distribution of wealth that we see in the historical record. There is another network that runs through the founding wealth of Sydney, one that is even more rarely discussed, and it has to do with the relationship between the colonial government and the intelligence networks of the British Crown. The Pacific in the early 19th century was strategically significant to Britain in ways that went beyond simple commercial calculation. The question of French influence in the Pacific was a constant concern for the British government. Napoleon's interest in the region was real, and the British response to it required intelligence that could not be gathered by official means alone. The ships that moved through the Pacific, the merchants who traded with Pacific Island communities, the men who had relationships with the Spanish settlements on the South American coast, these people had information that was strategically valuable, and some of them were providing that information to the British government in return for consideration that did not take the form of official payment. The consideration might take other forms: a land grant that was larger than officially justified, a contract for provisioning the colonial government that was awarded at above market rates, a protection from legal scrutiny that allowed commercial activities that would otherwise have attracted official attention, a connection to the governor's office that opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed. These arrangements were not unique to New South Wales. They were part of how British imperial power actually operated in the early 19th century, and the fact that they are not discussed openly in the official historical literature does not mean they did not happen. It means they were not the kind of thing that was written down in official documents, which is precisely the point. Now let us be very specific about what we are and are not saying here, because precision matters. We are saying that some of the founding wealth of Sydney's leading families is not adequately explained by the conventional account of entrepreneurial effort and favorable timing and colonial opportunity. We are saying that the gaps in the record, the murky financial origins, the suspiciously rapid accumulations of land and commercial influence, the connections to networks whose full scope is not visible in the colonial archives, all of these things point towards structures of informal power and informal capital that the official history has not fully reckoned with. We are not saying that this makes the founding families of Sydney unusual in the context of their time. Informal power, patron-client networks, the conversion of political connection into commercial advantage, these were standard features of the early modern commercial world. What is unusual is that the official history of Australia has been so reluctant to engage with this dimension of its founding, while the comparable dimension of other colonial founding stories, the corruption of American Gilded Age fortunes, the slave wealth of British Caribbean planters, the opium profits of East India Company shareholders, has at least been partially addressed. The founding wealth of Sydney deserves the same scrutiny. and that scrutiny reveals something more interesting and more complex than the pioneer narrative that the official history has preferred. Let us now move forward in time, into the middle decades of the 19th century, when the patterns established in the founding period were consolidated and extended, and when new mysteries began to accumulate on top of the old ones. The 1850s were the decade that changed everything in southeastern Australia. Gold was discovered in New South Wales in 1851. Within months, it was discovered in Victoria as well, and the gold rushes that followed were among the most dramatic events in the history of Pacific migration. People came from everywhere, from Britain and Ireland, from China, from California, from the German states, from South America, from the Pacific Islands. In the course of a few years, the population of the Australian colonies roughly tripled. Cities that had been small and provincial became genuinely urban. Commerce expanded beyond anything that the founding merchant families had imagined or planned for. The old colonial hierarchy was suddenly confronted with a democratic rush of people who had not grown up in its shadow and did not feel bound by its conventions. And yet, the families who had been wealthy before the gold rush ended, the gold rush era wealthier still. Not because they had found more gold than anyone else, though some of them had stakes in mining operations, but because they had positioned themselves in ways that looked prescient, but may have been something more than prescient, to benefit from the ancillary economy that the gold rush created. The supply of goods and services to the mining fields. The banking and financial services that gold required to be converted from raw metal into usable wealth. The land along the routes that connected the gold fields to the cities. The commercial real estate in the cities that served the suddenly expanded population. The founding families of Sydney had all of these things. They had the commercial networks, the access to credit, the land holdings, the political connections that allowed them to turn the gold rush from a disruption of the existing order into an amplification of their existing advantages. How? How did they know to be in the right positions? How did they have the capital available to move quickly when the rush began? How did they maintain their advantages in a period that was, in almost every other respect, chaotic and unpredictable? One part of the answer is simply that accumulated wealth tends to be self-perpetuating. Men who already had capital and land and connections in 1851 were better positioned to profit from any economic expansion than men who had nothing. This is not a mystery. This is just how wealth works. But another part of the answer involves something that is more interesting and less often discussed. The founding families of Sydney had, by the 1850s, developed information networks that were significantly more sophisticated than those available to ordinary commercial actors. They had correspondents in London and Liverpool and Canton and Singapore who were sending them information about shipping movements, commodity prices, political developments, and commercial opportunities, well before that information became public knowledge. They had relationships with officials in the colonial government who kept them informed about policy decisions that would affect land values and commercial regulations. They had, in short, the kind of information advantage that in any era translates directly into commercial advantage. Where did these information networks come from? They had been built, over the preceding decades, by the same men and families through the same informal channels that we have been tracing throughout this story. They were the legacy of the connections to British imperial intelligence networks, of the relationships built through the Pacific trade, of the patron-client relationships with successive governors that had been maintained through careful cultivation and strategic service. The wealth of Sydney's founding families in the gold rush era was not luck. It was the return on investments made in the founding period in information and relationships rather than in gold or land or commerce. The gold and land and commerce were the visible expression of those investments, but the investments themselves were in forms that do not appear in official accounts. This is the hidden history of how Sydney's wealthy families maintained and extended their position through one of the most destabilizing events in Australian colonial history. And it points toward a more general principle that runs through the entire story we have been tracing. The visible wealth, the land and the buildings and the businesses and the commercial reputations was always the surface. Underneath it was a structure of informal power, of connections and information and influence. That was the real foundation. And that structure was built in spaces that the official record does not document well, in conversations that were not written down, in relationships that were maintained through personal loyalty rather than formal contract, in networks that operated across the boundaries of official institutions without being contained by any of them. Now, let us step back from the specific historical narrative for a moment and ask a bigger question. Why does this matter? Why does the origin of the wealth of families who have been dead for a century or more matter to anyone today? It matters for several reasons, and they are not all obvious. The most direct reason is that land and wealth transferred in the early colonial period did not disappear. It was not dissipated or redistributed through some natural process of economic leveling. Much of it, in various forms, is still concentrated in ways that connect back, directly or indirectly, to the founding transfers. The institutional patterns established in the founding period, the relationship between political connection and commercial advantage, the information networks, the informal power structures, these have not simply ended. They have evolved and adapted, but the fundamental patterns remain. Understanding where these patterns came from, understanding that the founding wealth of Sydney was not simply the product of individual effort and market forces, but was built through structures of informal power and patronage and information advantage that existed in parallel to the postulated official colonial order, is necessary for understanding why those patterns persist and what their persistence means. But there is another reason this matters, and it is harder to articulate but perhaps more important. The official history of Sydney's founding families is a story about possibility, about how individuals with energy and vision and courage built something from nothing at the edge of the world. It is an inspirational narrative, and it is not entirely false. These were genuinely capable people who did genuinely remarkable things. But it is a narrative that has been constructed to obscure the degree to which what they built was built on structures of informal power that were not available to most of the people who were also trying to build lives in the colony. The convicts who served sentences and then tried to make their way as free people in New South Wales were working without the informal power networks that gave some of the founding families their advantages. The Aboriginal people who were dispossessed of the land that became the foundation of those families' wealth were not simply inconveniences in a story about European enterprise. They were the people whose dispossession made the enterprise possible. The Chinese miners who came to the goldfields and faced systematic discrimination and violence were not simply outside the story of Sydney's founding wealth. They were inside it, as the people whose labor and whose commercial activities enriched the men who already had the connections to capitalize on the gold rush. The official history of Sydney's founding families is a story told from the perspective of the winners. And like all stories told from that perspective, it has chosen what to emphasize and what to leave out in ways that serve the interests of those who benefit from the current arrangement of things. What gets left out, what the mainstream historical account has never fully addressed, is precisely the informal structure of power and capital and information that explains how the winners won. We have been tracing that structure tonight. We have found the gaps in the record. We have identified the questions that do not get answered. We have suggested the kinds of explanations that fit the evidence better than the conventional narratives do. Now let us go even deeper, because there are dimensions of this story that we have not yet addressed, and some of them are stranger than anything we have discussed so far. There is a persistent set of claims circulating in the more speculative corners of Australian historical discussion that the origins of Sydney's founding wealth are connected to something even more fundamental than the informal networks of the Pacific trade or the patron-client relationships of colonial administration. These claims connect the story to a much older pattern of hidden capital, of wealth that moves through history in ways that are deliberately obscured, of families that appear to arise from nothing because the sources of their capital are sources that cannot be officially acknowledged. We need to be careful here. We are moving from documented history into territory where the evidence is thinner and the interpretations more contested. But we are not moving into territory that is entirely without evidence. And the patterns we have identified in the documented record make these broader claims worth examining seriously rather than dismissing out of hand. The claim, in its most general form, is this: that some portion of the capital that built early colonial Sydney was not colonial capital at all, that it came from older and more obscure sources, from networks of financial power that had been operating across multiple colonial contexts before Sydney was even founded, and that found in the new colony an opportunity to extend their operations into a new geographic space, under circumstances that offered unusual advantages in terms of distance from scrutiny and the relative weakness of official oversight. What would these networks look like? They would look like informal webs of connection among men of similar background and similar interests, who shared information and capital through personal loyalty rather than formal contract. They would look like the ability to move money across national and colonial boundaries without official documentation. They would look like the capacity to translate informal influence over colonial governors into formal grants and contracts and protections. They would look, in other words, very much like what we have already been describing. The difference between the documented informal networks we have been tracing and these broader claims is a matter of scale and of origin. The broader claims suggest that these networks were not simply ad hoc arrangements made by opportunistic individuals in the specific context of colonial New South Wales. They suggest that they were manifestations of more persistent structures of power that predated the colony and survived it, that operated across multiple colonial contexts simultaneously, and that constituted, in effect, a shadow economy of global scope that is still operating in forms that are recognizable to those who know how to look for them. Is this true? The honest answer is that the evidence is insufficient to prove it, in the sense that a court would require proof. But the evidence is also insufficient to dismiss it, and the patterns we have found in the colonial record are consistent with it in ways that are not easily explained by the conventional alternatives. We are going to leave this broader claim as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. But we are going to carry it with us as we continue tracing the story, because it provides a frame within which some of the most puzzling aspects of the founding wealth of Sydney make more sense than they do within the conventional frame. Let us return now to specific names and specific stories, because the abstract becomes more meaningful when it is grounded in the particular. The MacArthur family continued to dominate large portions of New South Wales land throughout the 19th century. John MacArthur's sons carried on the wool business with considerable success, and the family's land holdings expanded rather than contracted over time. But there was something in the pattern of that expansion that deserves attention. The MacArthur estates were concentrated in the Camden district southwest of Sydney and in the Hunter Valley north of Sydney. These were the areas that, as the 19th century progressed, became two of the most important agricultural regions in New South Wales. The Camden district, in particular, became so closely associated with the MacArthur family that the town itself was essentially a MacArthur property in its earliest decades. The family did not simply own land in Camden. They owned the commercial infrastructure, the warehousing, the road connections, the mill. They controlled the economic life of the entire region in a way that had no formal basis in colonial law, but had a very effective practical basis in their control of the physical and commercial geography. How did they achieve this? Through the same combination of land grants, commercial investment, and informal political influence that we have been tracing throughout this story. But the Camden case is interesting because the scale of the control is sufficiently complete that it points towards something more deliberate than opportunism. This looks like the kind of territorial commercial dominance that requires a plan, executed over time, with consistent backing from sources of capital that extended beyond any individual's personal resources. The question of where the MacArthur backing came from is one that the family's own records do not fully answer. John MacArthur's papers, which are preserved in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, are extensive and have been studied carefully by historians. They show a man of genuine commercial intelligence and considerable energy, a man who thought carefully about markets and commodities and the requirements of his business. But they also show gaps. There are references to correspondence that no longer exists. There are financial arrangements that are alluded to but not documented. There are London connections that are mentioned but not explained. The gaps are interesting not because they necessarily indicate wrongdoing, but because they indicate that some of what was shaping the MacArthur family's fortunes was happening outside the channels that John MacArthur chose to document, in the papers he left behind, and that in itself is a kind of information. Let us now turn to the question that has been hovering over this entire story, the question of what exactly was happening in the Pacific during this period that created the conditions for the founding wealth of Sydney, and how that connects to historical patterns that extend well beyond the specific story of any one colonial family. The Pacific in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was, as we have noted, a space of unusual commercial freedom and unusual commercial opportunity. But it was also, and this is the dimension that the standard commercial history tends to underemphasize, a space of cultural encounter and exchange that was changing both the European and the Pacific Island worlds in ways that are still not fully understood. The European ships that entered the Pacific from the 1770s onward were not simply trading vessels. They were ambassadors of a commercial and cultural system that was, in effect, reorganizing Pacific societies around the logic of European commercial exchange. The trade in iron tools and cloth and firearms was not simply a commercial transaction. It was a transformation of the material basis of Pacific Island life, and through that transformation, a transformation of the social and political structures of those societies. The men who controlled the trade controlled, in effect, the direction of that transformation. And some of those men were operating from Sydney. This is a story about power that operates through commerce, about the way in which the control of material resources can shape political outcomes in ways that are more durable and more effective than direct political control. And it is a story that connects the founding wealth of Sydney to a much larger narrative about how European commercial expansion reshaped the world in the 19th century. The families who built that wealth were not simply entrepreneurs. They were participants, some of them active and some of them passive, in a process of global reorganization that was producing consequences for Pacific Island communities that are still working themselves out today. The land they accumulated was not simply land. It was land that had been removed from one system of management and incorporated into another through a process that was enabled by the commercial networks that those families were part of. Understanding this does not make those families uniquely villainous. It makes them historically significant in ways that go beyond their private commercial success. And it suggests that the question of where their wealth came from is not simply a question about individual biography or family history. It is a question about the structures of global power that were operating through the specific context of early colonial Sydney. And those structures are not simply historical. They are the foundation on which subsequent structures have been built, and through that foundation they continue to shape the present in ways that are traceable if you know where to look. Let us spend some time now tracing those subsequent structures, because the story of Sydney's founding wealth does not end in the founding period. It has a long aftermath, and that aftermath is still unfolding. The families who built Sydney's early wealth did not simply hold on to what they had. They reproduced themselves through marriage and through institutional investment in ways that ensured their influence would outlast the specific conditions of the colonial founding period. The strategies they used for this reproduction are themselves revealing because they show the degree to which these families understood that their position rested on foundations that required active maintenance rather than passive inheritance. Marriage was one of the primary instruments of that maintenance. The founding families intermarried with each other with a consistency that looks, when you map it out, remarkably deliberate. The MacArthurs married the Campbells and the Wentworths and the Blaxlands. The Wentworths married the Lawsons and the Darcys. The merchant families connected themselves to the pastoral families, who connected themselves to the professional families, who connected themselves back to the government families. Within 2 generations of the founding period, there was, in effect, a single extended network of familial connection among Sydney's elite that crossed all the officially distinct categories of colonial society. This was not unique to Sydney. Colonial elites everywhere tended toward endogamy, toward the marriage of family members to others within the same social stratum. But the Sydney case has a particular intensity to it. a density of connection that goes beyond what you would expect even from a small colonial elite exercising common social preferences. And that density served a function that goes beyond mere social preference. A network that is bound by familial as well as commercial ties is a network that is much more difficult to penetrate from outside. Information shared within such a network is protected not just by commercial confidentiality, but by family loyalty. Capital moved within such a network is moved through channels that are not visible to outsiders and not necessarily subject to the documentation that purely commercial transactions would require. Disputes within such a network are settled through the mechanisms of family mediation rather than through the courts, which means they are settled without creating the public record that court proceedings would generate. The founding families of Sydney built, through their patterns of intermarriage, exactly the kind of network that is most effective at preserving informal power across generations. And they maintained that network through the 19th century and into the 20th with remarkable consistency. The institutional dimensions of this maintenance are equally significant. The founding families invested heavily in the institutions that would shape colonial and eventually Australian life. The churches, the schools, the banks, the professional associations, the charitable foundations. This investment was not simply philanthropy, though it had a philanthropic dimension. It was a form of institutional capture, of ensuring that the organizations that trained the next generation of professionals, that provided credit to the next generation of entrepreneurs, that conferred social legitimacy on the next generation of individuals, were organizations that were shaped by the values and interests and perspectives of the founding families. The result, by the end of the 19th century, was an institutional landscape in Sydney that, while publicly open and formally democratic in most of its official structures, was in practice shaped by a network of informal influences that connected back through the institution's governing boards and donor relationships and educational connections to the founding families and their successors. This is not a secret. It is not a conspiracy. It is simply how institutions work when they are built and maintained by people with common interests and common backgrounds. But recognizing it for what it is requires looking at the founding period clearly and honestly, which the official history of Sydney has been reluctant to do. Now, we need to address something that has been implicit throughout this entire discussion, but that we have not yet stated directly. The wealth that built Sydney's founding families, the wealth that these families then reproduced and institutionalized across the 19th century, this wealth was built in a specific context. That context was the colonization of land that already belonged to someone, the extraction of labor from people who were not free to refuse it, and the exploitation of commercial networks that had their own victims as well as their own beneficiaries. To trace the origins of Sydney's founding wealth without naming these dimensions is to tell an incomplete story. The land grants that gave the MacArthurs and Campbells and Wentworths and Lords the physical foundation of their wealth were grants of land that had been taken from Aboriginal communities through a process of dispossession that involved violence and disease and the deliberate destruction of the social and economic systems on which those communities depended. The official fiction of terra nullius, the legal claim that the land had been unoccupied before European settlement, was a fiction that served the specific purpose of making that dispossession legally invisible. It was not an accurate description of any reality. The land was not unoccupied. It was managed and inhabited by communities with sophisticated economic and cultural systems, and those communities did not consent to the dispossession that the colonial land grant system embodied. The labor of convicts who worked on the farms and in the workshops of the founding families was labor extracted under coercive conditions that created commercial advantages for the employers that were not available to commercial actors in competitive markets. The founding families did not simply benefit from the available labor pool of a colonial economy. They benefited from the specific advantage of being able to direct convict labor to their own enterprises through the informal influence they held over the assignment system. And that advantage was not a market advantage but a political one, dependent on the maintenance of the political connections we have been tracing throughout this story. The commercial networks that moved goods through the Pacific were networks that extracted value from Pacific Island communities through exchange conditions that were, in many cases, profoundly asymmetric. The men on the Sydney end of those exchanges had access to goods and credit and information that Pacific Island communities did not have access to, and that asymmetry was built into the terms of trade in ways that ensured the primary commercial benefit flowed to the Sydney merchants rather than to their Pacific trading partners. All of this is part of the story of how Sydney's founding wealth was built, and naming it is not about assigning blame to individuals who are long dead and who were operating within the moral frameworks of their time. It is about understanding the actual structure of the founding wealth, about tracing all of its sources, including the ones that the official history prefers to leave unnamed. Because only by understanding the actual structure of the founding wealth can you understand why the inequalities it produced have been so persistent, why the institutional patterns it established have been so durable, and why the question of where the money came from is a question that continues to matter for the present, rather than being merely a matter of historical curiosity. Let us now take stock of what we have established and where we need to go from here. We have established that the conventional account of Sydney's founding wealth is inadequate in several specific ways. It underestimates the role of informal power networks in enabling the initial accumulation. It overestimates the degree to which individual entrepreneurial effort explains the speed and scale of that accumulation. It obscures the connections between the founding family's commercial activities and the broader networks of Pacific trade and British imperial intelligence operations within which those activities were embedded. And it fails to account for the structural context, the dispossession, the coercive labor, the asymmetric trade that made the founding wealth possible. We have identified specific families and specific stories that illustrate these patterns more concretely than the general narrative does. We have traced the gap between the official record and what the official record cannot explain. And we have suggested that the patterns we find in the colonial record are consistent with the operation of informal power structures that are larger and more persistent than any single colonial context. Now we need to go further. We need to trace the specific mechanisms through which the founding wealth was preserved and extended through the 19th century into the modern period. We need to look at what happened when these patterns encountered the challenges of democratic politics, of economic cycles, of technological change. And we need to follow the story all the way to the present, because this is not a story that ended in the 19th century. The patterns we are tracing are still operating in evolved forms, and understanding them requires following them all the way to where they are now. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable, because while it is relatively safe in public discourse to criticize the founding families of colonial Sydney as historical actors operating in a historical context, it is considerably less comfortable to suggest that the patterns they established are still in operation, and that the structures they built are still shaping the distribution of wealth and power in contemporary Australian society. But that is what the evidence suggests, and we are going to follow the evidence. Let us begin by tracing what happened to the founding merchant families of Sydney through the middle and late decades of the 19th century, because that period is when the patterns we have identified became institutionalized in ways that made them significantly harder to disrupt. By 1840, the colony of New South Wales had moved beyond its founding period in a political sense. The era of the autocratic governor who could grant land and dispense favor according to personal judgment was giving way to something more recognizable as constitutional government. Elected councils were established. The principle that the colonists should have some say in their own administration was being acknowledged, at least in its more cautious forms. The franchise was narrow and property-based, but it existed. This shift toward constitutional government was, in one sense, a constraint on the informal power of the founding families, because it introduced new actors and new accountability mechanisms. But, in another sense, it was an opportunity. Because a property-based franchise in a society where property was heavily concentrated among a small elite is not a genuinely democratic institution, it is a formal democratic structure that produces, as its regular output, government by the propertied class. The founding families of Sydney understood this immediately. They engaged with the new constitutional structures not as constraints on their power, but as new instruments of it. They stood for election to the new councils. They funded the election campaigns of men who shared their commercial interests. They shaped the procedural rules of the new institutions to maximize their effective influence within them. And they did all of this while simultaneously maintaining the informal networks of connection and influence that had been the actual foundation of their power since the beginning. The result was a colonial political economy in which the formal democratic institutions and the informal power networks operated in parallel, with the formal institutions providing the legitimacy and the informal networks providing the direction. This is a pattern that students of political science will recognize, because it is a pattern that appears in virtually every society where formal democratic institutions are grafted onto pre-existing structures of concentrated wealth and informal power. The formal institutions are real, in the sense that they are genuinely consequential in specific cases and on specific issues. But they operate within a context shaped by the informal networks, and when the two come into conflict, the informal networks generally prevail. The Bank of New South Wales, founded in 1817, and now operating under a different name as one of Australia's major financial institutions, was one of the primary vehicles through which the founding families institutionalized their financial power. The bank's founding shareholders were drawn heavily from the same networks we have been tracing. The bank's early lending policies reflected the commercial priorities of those shareholders. And the bank's governance, through its board of directors and its connections to the colonial government, was structured in ways that maintained the alignment between the bank's operations and the interests of the founding commercial elite. This is not a claim that the bank was corrupt in any simple or straightforward sense. It was a legitimate financial institution that provided real services to the colonial economy. But its governance and its lending priorities reflected the social and commercial structure of the society within which it operated, and that structure was one in which the founding families occupied a privileged position. Understanding this does not require attributing bad faith to anyone. It requires recognizing that institutions are shaped by the people who build them, and that those people inevitably build institutions that reflect their own interests and perspectives. What the Bank of New South Wales provided for the founding commercial families of Sydney was something that they had previously had to obtain through informal channels: access to credit at reasonable terms with institutional backing. With the bank in place, the commercial elite no longer needed to rely exclusively on the informal credit networks that had sustained their early expansion. They had a formal institution that could perform those functions with the legitimacy and durability that formal institutions provide. But the informal networks did not disappear. They adapted. They found new functions within the new institutional landscape. They became the channels through which information about the bank's lending decisions was informally shared among the connected elite before that information became public. They became the channels through which the governance of the bank was shaped by interests that were not visible to its ordinary shareholders. They became, in short, the shadow structure that operated within and around the formal institution, giving those who were connected to the shadow structure advantages over those who were not. This pattern of formal institutions with informal shadow structures operating within and around them is one of the most persistent features of the Sydney commercial elite's history, and it extends well beyond the Bank of New South Wales. The pastoral industry associations that emerged in New South Wales from the 1820s onward were another vehicle for the institutionalization of informal power. These associations, which eventually formed the basis for the political organizations that represented large landholders in colonial and later state politics, were ostensibly commercial interest groups advocating for the specific needs of the wool and cattle industries. And they were that. But they were also something else. They were formal structures that codified and maintained the informal networks of the founding pastoral families, providing them with organizational capacity and political legitimacy while preserving the personal and familial character of the connections that were their real foundation. The squatters, as the large pastoralists were known, constitute one of the most interesting chapters in the story of Sydney's founding wealth, because they represent the extension of the patterns we have been tracing into a new geographic and commercial context. The The squatter movement in New South Wales from the 1830s onward was not, despite the romantic narrative that has grown up around it, a movement of independent pioneers pushing into the Australian interior and carving out lives through sheer personal effort. It was, in significant part, a movement organised and financed by the same networks that had built Sydney's founding commercial wealth, and it was directed, at least in its most successful manifestations, by men who had access to capital and connections that ordinary settlers did not have. The squatters who ended up with the largest and most valuable runs in the interior of New South Wales were not, as a group, the men who had arrived first or who had worked hardest or who had taken the greatest risks. They were, disproportionately, men with connections to the Sydney commercial elite, men who had access to colonial banking credit, men whose land selections were guided by information about which areas had the best water access and the best grass and the best future prospects for value appreciation, information that was available to those who were connected to the right networks, but not to those who were not. The squatter who arrived in an area first, who occupied the land in the technical sense that gave rise to the term squatter, was often not the man who ended up holding the land in the long run. That man was often someone from Sydney, with a solicitor and a banker, and connections in the colonial government, who acquired the squatter's occupancy rights at a price that reflected the squatter's immediate cash needs rather than the long-term value of the land. This process of accumulation, through which the actual labor of occupation and development was performed by men who did not ultimately benefit from it, and the benefit accrued to men who had access to capital but performed none of the labor, is a pattern that repeats throughout the story of Sydney's founding wealth. It is visible in the convict labour system of the founding period. It is visible in the Pacific trade networks where the actual physical work of collecting sandalwood and sea cucumber was done by Pacific Island communities whose compensation was asymmetric with their contribution. And it is visible in the squatting movement, where the work of establishing viable pastoral runs was done by men who rarely ended up as the long-term owners. Understanding this pattern is important for understanding why the founding wealth of Sydney was so concentrated in so few hands. It was not simply that those hands were more capable or more energetic or more far-sighted than others. It was that those hands had access to the structural advantages, the credit, the information, the legal connections, the political influence, that allowed them to appropriate the value created by other people's labor and knowledge and risk-taking. Let us now look at the second half of the 19th century, which is the period when the patterns we have been tracing began to encounter new challenges, and when the strategies for maintaining elite privilege evolved in response. The gold rush of the 1850s, as we noted earlier, was one challenge. The rapid expansion of the colonial population, the influx of people who had no connection to the founding networks and no deference to the founding hierarchy, was a genuine disruption. But the founding families navigated it successfully through the mechanisms we have already described: positioning, information advantage, credit access. The other major challenge of the second half of the 19th century was the rise of a labor movement and the gradual extension of political democracy that came with it. As the franchise expanded, as organized labor began to develop collective bargaining capacity, as the political parties that represented working-class interests began to gain electoral success, the informal power of the commercial elite was increasingly under pressure from formal democratic institutions that were actually becoming more genuinely democratic. How did the founding commercial elite respond to this pressure? They did several things simultaneously. They invested more heavily in the formal political institutions, funding the parties and candidates that were most aligned with their interests, and ensuring that even the parties ostensibly representing working-class interests had leaders who were, through education and social connection, more oriented toward the commercial elite's worldview than their nominal constituency might have expected. They invested in the cultural institutions, the newspapers and the churches and the educational foundations that shaped public opinion in ways that were favorable to their commercial interests. And they diversified, moving capital from the most politically exposed positions, from pure landholding and from industries that were most directly organized labor's targets, into forms of investment that were less visible and less politically vulnerable. This last strategy is particularly interesting because it required the founding families and their successors to develop a more sophisticated understanding of financial investment than the pastoral economy had required. It required them to develop connections to the new forms of financial capital that were emerging in the late 19th century, the corporate structures, the investment trusts, the insurance companies, the infrastructure investments that were reshaping the financial landscape of the industrial world. And developing those connections required, again, access to networks of information and relationship that were not available to ordinary investors. The founding families of Sydney, who successfully navigated the transition from the pastoral economy of the mid-19th century to the corporate economy of the late 19th century, did so because they had access to those networks, because the informal structure of connection that had been built in the founding period was still operating, still maintaining and transmitting the advantages that derived from being inside rather than outside. The families that did not successfully navigate this transition, and there were several that did not, provide an interesting contrast case. They tended to be families where the informal connections were somehow disrupted, where the generational transmission of the network membership failed for personal or circumstantial reasons, where the family found itself on the outside of the information flows that determined who benefited from the new investment opportunities and who did not. The pattern of successful succession and occasional failure among the founding families of Sydney is not random. When you map it against the social and institutional networks, the families that sustained their wealth over multiple generations were consistently the families that sustained their institutional connections over those same generations, that maintained their church memberships and their club memberships and their board positions and their social relationships with the other families who constituted the informal network. And the families that lost their position, the ones that fell out of the elite over time, were consistently the ones where those institutional connections were allowed to lapse or were disrupted by internal family conflict or personal scandal. This is not a pattern that proves a conspiracy or even a deliberately organized system. It is simply the pattern of how informal power networks actually work across generations. They are maintained by active participation and actively deteriorate when that participation ceases. The founding families of Sydney, or at least the most successful among them, understood this and behaved accordingly. Now, let us address the most uncomfortable dimension of this story, the dimension that most historical accounts of Sydney's founding families choose not to engage with directly. The wealth that was accumulated in the founding period and maintained through the 19th century was not simply personal wealth. It was wealth that shaped the institutional landscape of an entire society, and that institutional shaping has had consequences that extend far beyond the founding families themselves. The educational institutions that the founding families endowed and governed in the 19th century have shaped the education of multiple generations of Australians. And that shaping has been, systematically, in ways that privilege certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of social connection over others. The schools and universities that were built with founding family money and governed by founding family networks have produced graduates who, by virtue of their education, have had privileged access to the same networks that produced the original wealth. The old boy network is not a metaphor in this context. It is a precise description of a functioning system. The media institutions, the newspapers that the founding commercial families established or influenced in the 19th century, have shaped public discourse about economic and political questions in ways that reflect the interests of the commercial elite, far more than they reflect the interests of the broader population. The transformation of those newspapers, through the 20th century, into larger media corporations does not fundamentally change this pattern. It simply scales it and makes it somewhat less visible. The banking and financial institutions that were established with founding family participation in the 19th century have maintained, through their governance structures and their lending priorities and their relationships with the political class, a consistent orientation toward the interests of concentrated wealth that reflects their origins. The specific families are no longer necessarily on the governing boards, but the institutional culture, the set of assumptions and priorities that shapes the institution's operations, reflects a heritage that runs back to the founding period. And the land that was transferred to the founding families through the grant system and through the squatting occupation of the interior is, in forms that have been transformed and subdivided and developed many times over, still a primary source of concentrated wealth in the Sydney metropolitan area and in the agricultural regions of New South Wales. The connection between the original land grants and the contemporary distribution of land wealth is not direct or simple, but it is traceable, in broad outline, through the history of property transfer and development that has occurred across the intervening 2 centuries. This is why the question of where Sydney's founding wealth came from is not merely a historical question. It is a question about the structural foundations of a contemporary society, about why certain patterns of advantage and disadvantage are so persistent, about why certain families and institutions occupy the positions they occupy, about why certain assumptions about who deserves wealth and who does not are so deeply embedded in the culture. These are important questions, and they cannot be answered by the conventional narrative, which tells a story about vision and enterprise and individual achievement. They require the kind of structural analysis that we have been doing throughout this story, the tracing of informal networks and information advantages and political connections, and the accumulated benefits of dispossession and coercive labor. Let us now take this analysis one step further and look at what happened to these patterns in the 20th century, because the story does not end at Federation in 1901 or at any of the other conventional endpoint markers in Australian history. It continues, and its contemporary dimensions are at least as interesting as its historical ones. The early 20th century brought new challenges to the patterns of concentrated wealth that had been established in the founding period. The growth of the welfare state, the extension of workers' rights, the progressive taxation that was introduced in the wake of 2 world wars, the general democratization of political and social life that occurred across the Western world in the 20th century, all of these created pressures on the informal power structures that had sustained the founding family's advantages. The response of the Sydney commercial elite to these pressures followed a pattern that is now familiar from our analysis of earlier challenges: adaptation rather than resistance, diversification rather than entrenchment, institutional investment rather than direct political opposition. The founding family networks did not disappear in the 20th century. They evolved. They became less visible, less associated with specific family names, and more associated with institutional and corporate structures. The individual patriarch who held land and wielded personal influence was replaced, as the primary form of elite power, by the board of directors and the institutional shareholder, and the professional advisor who managed the assets of inherited wealth while maintaining plausible distance from the original sources of that wealth. This evolution made the persistence of founding family advantage harder to see, but not less real. The family whose pastoral wealth had been accumulated in the 19th century did not lose that wealth in the 20th century simply because they could not. They converted it into corporate shares, into property trusts, into institutional endowments, into private equity investments, into the diversified portfolio of a modern high net worth family whose specific sources of income are private and whose ultimate beneficial ownership of various assets is structured through legal entities designed to maximize privacy as well as returns. The corporate and trust structures through which inherited wealth is managed in the contemporary period are the 20th century evolution of the informal networks that managed the founding wealth in the colonial period. They serve the same function: the preservation and reproduction of wealth and the advantages that come with it across generations. They do it through different mechanisms and with different levels of visibility, but the underlying logic is the same. And the informal networks themselves, the social connections, the institutional affiliations, the personal relationships through which information and capital and influence move among the contemporary elite, are directly descended from the founding networks we have been tracing. The specific names have changed, The specific mechanisms have evolved, but the structure of insider advantage, of access to information and relationships that is not available to those outside the network, is recognizable as the contemporary form of what existed in colonial Sydney. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural observation about how elite advantage is reproduced across generations, and it is an observation that is supported by a substantial body of sociological and economic research on wealth concentration and social mobility. What we are adding to that general observation is the specific historical analysis that traces these patterns back to their origins in the founding period of colonial Sydney, and that identifies the specific mechanisms, the land grants, the Pacific trade networks, the patron-client relationships with colonial governors, the informal credit networks, through which the initial advantage was established. The story of Sydney's founding families is, in this reading, not a story about the creation of wealth from nothing. It is a story about the conversion of informal power into formal wealth and the subsequent reproduction of that wealth through institutional structures that maintain the informal power in evolved forms. It is a story about the persistence of advantage and the structures that make that persistence possible. And it is a story that has almost never been told this way, in mainstream historical accounts, precisely because the institutions through which the founding families maintain their influence include the institutions that shape historical accounts, the universities and the museums and the cultural foundations and the media organizations that, in various ways, tell the story of Sydney's past. This is not to say that historians who have worked on this period are consciously suppressing inconvenient truths. Most of them are doing their work in good faith within the frameworks and the source materials that are available to them. But frameworks and source materials are themselves products of historical choices about what to preserve and what to emphasize, and those choices have been made over the generations by institutions that have been shaped by the same networks of informal power that we have been tracing. The official archive of colonial New South Wales, the records that historians work from, is not a neutral record of everything that happened. It is a record of what official institutions chose to document, supplemented by the personal records of individuals who chose to preserve their papers and donate them to public collections. The gaps in that record are not random. They are concentrated, as we have noted at specific points throughout this story, at the moments and in the topics where the informal structures of power were most visibly at work. The land grant negotiations that were informal did not produce written records. The credit arrangements that were based on personal trust rather than formal contract were not documented. The intelligence relationships that were the quid pro quo for political favor were never officially acknowledged. The result is an archive that has the shape of a story about individual enterprise and market opportunity, because that is the story that the official channels were able to document, while the underlying story about informal power and structural advantage has had to be reconstructed through inference from what is visible at the edges of the official record. That reconstruction is what we have been doing tonight. And we have found at the edges of the official record a story that is significantly different from the one the official record was designed to tell. Let us now move into the most recent period of this history, the period from roughly the middle of the 20th century to the present, because this is where the story connects most directly to the questions that matter for anyone living in Sydney, or in Australia more broadly, today. The post-war period from the late 1940s through the 1960s was, in many respects, the most genuinely democratic and egalitarian period in Australian economic history. The policies of the post-war consensus, the full employment commitment, the expansion of public education, the progressive tax structures, the subsidized housing programs, the social welfare systems, produced a degree of material equality that was historically unprecedented in Australia. The gap between the wealthiest and the poorest Australians narrowed significantly during this period, and the formal barriers to social mobility, while not eliminated, were reduced from the levels that had prevailed in the pre-war period. But the elite networks did not disappear during this period. They contracted, became more defensive, focused on preserving what could not be converted, into the new currency of educational credentialism and professional qualification. And they waited. The neoliberal turn of the late 1970s and 1980s, which in Australia was associated primarily with the Hawke-Keating government's program of economic liberalisation, opened new opportunities for concentrated wealth that had been foreclosed by the post-war settlement. The deregulation of financial markets, the privatization of public assets, the reduction of top marginal tax rates, the shift from labor to capital in the distribution of economic surplus, all of these created conditions under which the inherited advantages of the founding family's successors could once again be converted into significant economic advantage. The families and institutions that benefited most from this period of deregulation and privatization were not, in the main, new actors. They were institutions with deep roots in the colonial commercial elite, institutions with the capital, the connections, and the information advantages that allowed them to move quickly in the new deregulated environment. The banks that expanded most aggressively in the deregulated financial environment, the property developers who benefited most from the relaxation of planning and zoning controls, the pastoral companies that benefited from agricultural deregulation, the investment funds that managed the superannuation savings of ordinary Australians while charging fees that transferred a significant portion of that savings to the fund managers themselves. Many of these institutions had connections, some direct and some indirect, to the founding families and networks of colonial Sydney. Not because there was a direct personal continuity, but because the institutional cultures and the social networks that shaped who got access to opportunity in the deregulated environment were cultures and networks that had been shaped by the history we have been tracing. This is the contemporary dimension of the story of Sydney's founding wealth. It is not a story about specific individuals doing specific things that can be clearly identified as wrong. It is a story about structural advantage, about the way in which historical patterns of informal power create persistent advantages that compound across generations and that manifest in ways that are difficult to identify and challenge precisely because they are structural rather than individual. And it is a story that connects the present directly to the past in ways that the conventional historical narrative does not acknowledge. Why does Sydney look the way it looks today? Why is the distribution of wealth in Sydney concentrated in the ways that it is? Why do certain families and institutions occupy the positions they occupy? The conventional answer involves references to market forces and individual merit and the natural outcomes of economic competition. These explanations are not entirely wrong, but they are radically incomplete, because they ignore the structural advantages that derive from the founding period and that have been reproduced and extended through the institutional and network mechanisms we have been tracing. The complete answer requires acknowledging that Sydney's contemporary economic landscape was shaped, in fundamental ways, by the informal power structures of the colonial founding period, and that those structures, in evolved forms, are still operating. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. And it is a truth that the official narrative of Sydney's founding families, the story of vision and enterprise and pioneer achievement, was designed, whether consciously or not, to obscure. We have tried tonight to see past that obscuration. We have traced the informal networks, identified the gaps in the official record, followed the connections between the founding period and the present, and told the story that the official narrative leaves out. It is not a complete story. It cannot be. The gaps are real, and some of what lies in the gaps will never be recoverable. But it is a more complete story than the one that is usually told. And it is a story that matters, not just as history, but as a guide to understanding the present. Because the patterns we have been tracing, the conversion of informal power into formal wealth, the maintenance of that wealth through institutional investment and network reproduction, the persistence of structural advantage across generations, these patterns are not unique to Sydney. They are visible, in varying forms, in every society that has a colonial heritage and a concentrated commercial elite. Understanding how they work in the specific case of Sydney is a step toward understanding how they work in general. And understanding how they work in general is a prerequisite for thinking seriously about what, if anything, can be done to create more genuinely equal societies. Not through naive fantasies about erasing history or redistributing everything that has ever been accumulated unfairly, but through clear-eyed recognition of the structures that perpetuate advantage and disadvantage, and through the kind of institutional reform that those structures consistently resist, and that requires sustained political will to achieve. The story of Sydney's founding families is, in the end, a story about power, about how power is accumulated, how it is maintained, how it is reproduced across generations, and how it shapes the societies within which it operates. It is a story that the people who benefit from that power have every interest in keeping obscure, and that the rest of us have every interest in understanding as clearly as possible. We have been working toward that clarity tonight. Let us go even deeper now, into the specific question of what happened when those founding networks encountered the most significant external challenge of their history, the democratic moment of the early 20th century, and how the strategies of adaptation they developed in response to that challenge shaped the Sydney elite in ways that are still visible today. The Federation of the Australian Colonies in 1901 created a new political framework, but it did not create a new social order. The men who drafted the Australian Constitution, who negotiated the terms of federation, who built the institutions of the new Commonwealth government, were, in disproportionate numbers, men who were connected to the same networks that had built the colonial commercial elite of New South Wales and Victoria. The constitution they wrote reflected their interests and their worldview in ways that should not surprise anyone who has followed the analysis we have been developing throughout this story. The specific provisions of the Australian Constitution that protected property rights, that distributed power between the states and the Commonwealth in ways that preserved the influence of state-based commercial elites, that structured the Senate in ways that gave smaller states disproportionate power relative to population, but gave large landholders within those states disproportionate influence. These provisions were not accidental. They were the result of deliberate choices made by men who understood the institutional structures they were building and who built them with specific interests in mind. This is not an unusual or controversial claim about the Australian Constitution. Historians of the Federation period have long acknowledged that the Constitution was the product of a specific social class with specific interests. What is less often acknowledged is the degree to which those specific interests were the interests of the networks we have been tracing, the networks that had their origins in the founding period of colonial Sydney and that had spent the intervening decades building the institutional and social infrastructure through which their advantage was reproduced. The democratic challenge of the early 20th century, the rise of the Labour Party, the extension of universal suffrage, the growth of organised labour, was not something the founding networks had anticipated in the 1890s when the Constitution was being drafted. The architects of federation expected a property-based democracy in which the franchise would remain sufficiently restricted that the commercial elite could reliably shape electoral outcomes through the influence they exercised over economically dependent voters. The actual democratization that occurred in the early 20th century was more rapid and more thoroughgoing than the founders had expected, and it required a significant adaptation in the strategies through which elite power was maintained. The most important adaptation was the development of a new kind of institutional power, one that operated through the control of information and narrative, rather than through the direct control of votes or economic resources. The newspapers and eventually the radio stations and eventually the television networks that became the primary means by which Australians understood their political and economic world were, from their establishment in the early 20th century onward, shaped by interests that were connected to the founding commercial networks of colonial Sydney. Keith Murdoch, the father of Rupert Murdoch, built his Australian newspaper empire in the early 20th century through a combination of genuine journalistic talent and very strategic social and commercial relationships. The story of how Keith Murdoch obtained control of the Adelaide newspaper that became the foundation of the Murdoch media empire, and of how he used his relationships with British newspaper proprietors and with the political class of Australia, is itself a story about the conversion of informal social capital into formal commercial power in ways that should be familiar from our analysis of the colonial period. The media empires built by Murdoch and by the other major Australian newspaper proprietors of the 20th century were not simply commercial enterprises that happened to be in the news business. They were instruments of influence that shaped the political and economic environment in which commercial elites operated, and they were built and maintained by men who understood that controlling the flow of information in a democracy was a form of power that was at least as valuable as controlling votes or land. This insight that the control of narrative is a form of power is something that the founding commercial networks of colonial Sydney had understood from the beginning. The newspapers of the colonial period, the Sydney Morning Herald from its establishment in 1831 and its predecessors and successors, were not neutral commercial ventures. They were connected to the commercial elite through ownership and advertising relationships and through the social connections of their proprietors and editors, and they shaped the public understanding of economic and political questions in ways that reflected those connections. The evolution of the media in the 20th century did not change this fundamental dynamic. It scaled it and made it more sophisticated. The modern media conglomerates that dominate Australian information are the 20th and 21st century evolution of the same principle that drove the founding commercial elite to invest in print media in the 19th century. The recognition that controlling the story about wealth and power and opportunity is at least as important as controlling the wealth and power and opportunity themselves. There is another dimension of the early 20th century adaptation that deserves attention, and it has to do with the relationship between the founding networks and the new institutions of the welfare state. The labour movement in Australia in the early 20th century won significant victories, including the establishment of the basic wage, the 8-hour working day, systems of workers' compensation, and the beginnings of a social safety net. These victories were real and they mattered enormously to the people who won them. But they did not fundamentally alter the distribution of wealth or the informal structures through which that distribution was maintained. In part, this was because the labour victories were institutionalized in forms that the commercial elite could accommodate without sacrificing their structural advantages. The basic wage was a floor on labour costs, but it left intact the mechanisms through which capital was accumulated at the expense of labour. The social safety net was funded through progressive taxation, but the progressive tax system of the early 20th century was not nearly progressive enough to reverse the concentration of wealth that had been established in the founding period. The regulatory structures that governed commercial activity were made somewhat more demanding, but they were enforced by a regulatory apparatus that was staffed by people educated in the same institutions and connected through the same networks as the commercial elite they were supposed to be regulating. This is not to say that nothing changed. The welfare state genuinely improved the material conditions of working-class Australians, and the labour movement genuinely constrained the most exploitative aspects of the commercial elite's operations. But the structural advantages of the founding networks were preserved through adaptation, not eliminated through democratic pressure. The most elegant adaptation was the development of what we might call the patrician concession, the willingness of the commercial elite to accept, and in some cases to actively support, expansions of social provision that were sufficient to reduce the political temperature of working-class grievance without being large enough to threaten the fundamental structures of concentrated wealth. The commercial elite of early 20th century Sydney was not uniformly hostile to the welfare state. Some of its most sophisticated members actively supported certain welfare provisions, precisely because they understood that a level of material security for the working class reduced the likelihood of more radical political demands. This is a very old strategy, and it is a very effective one, and it required a particular kind of intelligence, a capacity to distinguish between the forms of reform that could be accommodated without fundamental change and the forms of reform that could not. The founding networks of Sydney had, by the early 20th century, developed that intelligence through the same processes of institutional learning and selective memory that had shaped all of their previous adaptations. The specific men who embodied this adaptation in early 20th century Sydney were an interesting mix. Some were the direct descendants of the founding families, carrying the family names and the family connections into a new era. Some were men who had acquired access to the founding networks through the educational and social connections that the networks had built in the 19th century. And some were men whose connection to the networks was primarily through the institutions, the banks and the churches and the clubs and the professional associations that the networks had established, and that continued to shape access to the informal advantages of being inside rather than outside. What they shared was an understanding of the specific challenge they faced: maintaining the structural advantages of concentrated wealth in a political environment that was increasingly hostile to the explicit expression of those advantages. The response they developed, and that their successors have continued to develop throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, was essentially one of institutional camouflage. The maintenance of substantive advantages through institutional structures that present a publicly acceptable face. The superannuation system is a contemporary example of this pattern that is worth examining in some detail, because it illustrates with unusual clarity how structural advantage is maintained within formally democratic institutional structures. The Australian superannuation system, established in its current form in the early 1990s, was presented as a democratizing financial reform, a mechanism for ensuring that ordinary working Australians would have access to savings for retirement rather than depending entirely on the age pension. And it has achieved some version of this goal. Most working Australians do accumulate superannuation savings over their careers, and those savings do provide some degree of retirement security. But the superannuation system also created, as a direct consequence of its design, one of the most significant concentrations of financial market power in Australian history. The mandatory superannuation contributions of millions of workers, pooled into a relatively small number of large funds, created pools of capital that are managed by a relatively small number of fund managers. And those fund managers, like the bankers and merchants of the colonial period, have both the information and the institutional connections to derive advantages from their positions that are not available to the ordinary savers whose money they manage. The governance of the major Australian superannuation funds, the composition of their boards, the selection of their fund managers, the institutional relationships through which their investment decisions are shaped, all of these reflect, in contemporary form, the same patterns of network-based insider advantage that we have been tracing throughout this story. The specific families of the founding period are not necessarily on those boards, but the institutional cultures and the social networks that shape who gets onto those boards and how those boards operate are directly descended from the networks that built the founding wealth of colonial Sydney. This is the living present of the story we have been telling. The patterns that originated in the informal power structures of colonial Sydney are still operating, in evolved forms, in the financial institutions and the media companies and the real estate investment trusts and the pastoral corporations and the professional services firms that constitute the contemporary Sydney commercial elite. Seeing this requires following the chain of institutional descent across 2 centuries, from the land grants of Governor Phillip and Governor Macquarie, through the commercial networks of Simeon Lord and Robert Campbell and John MacArthur, through the pastoral empires of the squatting era, through the financial institutions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, through the corporate structures of the post-war period, to the contemporary institutional landscape. It is a long chain, and the links are not all of equal strength or equal visibility. But the chain is real, and tracing it explains things about the contemporary distribution of wealth and power in Sydney that the conventional narratives of market forces and individual merit cannot explain. Now let us go to the most mysterious and most poorly documented dimension of this entire story, the dimension that we have been approaching throughout this discussion but have not yet addressed directly. There is a persistent thread in the historical literature on colonial New South Wales, appearing not in the mainstream texts, but in the more specialized scholarship on the Pacific trade and on the commercial networks of the early colonial period, that points toward a dimension of the founding wealth that is stranger than anything we have yet discussed. That thread connects the founding commercial networks of Sydney to a set of financial and commercial relationships that were operating at a global scale in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. relationships that are very thinly documented in official records, but that are visible, in outline, through their consequences in multiple colonial contexts simultaneously. The specific character of these relationships is difficult to describe without seeming to veer into the kind of speculation that is not supported by the available evidence. So let us be very precise about what the evidence actually shows and what it does not show, and let us be equally precise about what it suggests as a hypothesis. What the evidence shows is a pattern of financial and commercial coordination among a set of actors operating across multiple colonial contexts, including Sydney, but also including the Cape Colony, certain parts of the Caribbean, certain commercial houses in Canton and Calcutta and London, that cannot be adequately explained as the independent convergence of similar individual commercial strategies. The coordination is too precise, the timing is too consistent, the outcomes are too aligned for independent emergence to be a sufficient explanation. What the evidence does not show, and what we cannot claim, is the specific structure of the coordinating mechanism. We do not have documentary evidence of a formal organization or a specific set of agreements among the relevant actors. We have the pattern of outcomes and the network of connections, but we do not have the meeting minutes or the correspondence or the formal agreements that would constitute proof in a strict evidentiary sense. What the evidence suggests, as a hypothesis, is that the founding commercial networks of colonial Sydney were connected to a set of commercial and financial relationships that operated across colonial boundaries in ways that were deliberately non-documented, that relied on personal trust and familial connection rather than formal contract, and that constituted a form of international commercial coordination that was, in effect, invisible to the official regulatory and oversight systems of any individual colonial or national jurisdiction. This hypothesis fits the evidence better than the alternatives. It explains the coordination without requiring us to posit a formal organization that should have left documentary traces. It explains the consistent pattern of outcome across multiple colonial contexts without requiring implausible coincidences of independent strategy. And it is consistent with what we know about how commercial coordination actually operated in this period, through personal networks and familial connections rather than through formal institutional structures. The names that appear at the intersections of these networks are names that we have already encountered in this story. They are the founding merchant families of Sydney and their counterparts in other colonial contexts, and the men in the financial centres of London and Edinburgh and Amsterdam, who provided the credit and the information and the legal cover that allowed the networks to operate. What we are describing is not a secret society in the conspiratorial sense. It is something more mundane and more effective. A network of men who shared backgrounds and interests and who trusted each other with information and capital and assistance in ways that were not available to those outside the network, and who maintained that trust through the mechanisms of familial connection and shared institutional membership that we have been analyzing throughout this story. The international dimension of this network is what has been most consistently overlooked in the Australian historical literature, perhaps because Australian history has tended, for understandable reasons of national self-definition, to treat the colonial period as primarily a story about the relationship between Australia and Britain, rather than as a story about the integration of Australian colonial commerce into a set of global networks that had their own internal logic and their own organizing principles that were not reducible to the official relationship between colony and metropole. Understanding the founding wealth of Sydney requires understanding that the men who built it were operating within, and in some cases, actively shaping those global networks. And understanding those global networks requires looking at the colonial period through a lens that is wider than the colonial story usually employs. Let us now draw together the various threads we have been pursuing throughout this story and attempt to articulate, as clearly as the evidence allows, what we have found. We have found that the conventional account of Sydney's founding wealth is inadequate in multiple specific ways. It does not explain the speed and scale of certain accumulations. It does not account for the capital that was available to certain actors at moments when that capital should not have been available given their visible resources. It does not trace the connections between the founding family's commercial activities and the global networks within which those activities were embedded. and it does not acknowledge the structural context of dispossession and coercive labor and asymmetric trade that made the founding wealth possible. We have found that the gaps in the official record are not random. They are concentrated at the moments and in the topics where the informal structures of power were most visibly at work. And we have found that when you trace the connections that are visible at the edges of the official record, they point toward a set of informal, commercial, and financial networks that operated across colonial boundaries in ways that gave certain actors systematic advantages that are not visible in the official account. We have traced those networks through the 19th century into the 20th, showing how they adapted to the challenges of democratic politics and institutional change without surrendering the fundamental structural advantages that derived from the founding period. And we have suggested that the patterns we find in the historical record, the informal networks, the institutional inheritance, the structural advantages of inside access to information and capital, are still operating, in evolved forms, in the contemporary institutional landscape of Sydney and of Australia more broadly. This is not a comfortable story. It is not the story that the institutions shaped by the founding networks prefer to tell about themselves. But it is a more accurate story than the conventional alternative. And accuracy matters for reasons that go beyond historical curiosity. Accuracy about where the founding wealth came from is necessary for thinking clearly about what obligations that wealth carries, about what responsibilities are owed by those who have benefited from structural advantages to those who have borne the structural disadvantages, about what genuine democratic equality would require in a society whose formal equality is built on foundations of historical inequality. These are questions that Australian society has not yet answered, in part because the official history has consistently obscured the nature of the foundations. But they are questions that will not go away simply because they are uncomfortable. They are built into the structure of Australian society, visible in the distribution of wealth and opportunity, and in the persistent patterns of advantage and disadvantage that cannot be explained by market forces and individual merit alone. We have been trying tonight to make those foundations visible, to trace the specific historical processes through which the patterns we live with were established, to tell the story that was designed not to be told. It is an imperfect story. The evidence is incomplete. The inferences are sometimes speculative. The connections are sometimes difficult to establish with the certainty that a rigorous scholarly account would require. But it is a story that is built on what the evidence actually shows, on the gaps that the evidence reveals, and on the patterns that those gaps suggest. And it is a story that raises questions that have not been adequately asked, let alone adequately answered, by the mainstream historical account of how Sydney's wealthiest families appeared from nowhere in the 1800s and built the institutional foundations of contemporary Australian society. The question of where they came from, where the money came from, where the connections came from, who backed them, and why, and what was given in return for that backing, is a question that the official story has never fully answered. We have tried tonight to narrow the range of possible answers. We have not solved the mystery, but we have made it harder to pretend that the mystery does not exist. And sometimes, making the mystery visible is the most important thing you can do. The night is deepening now, and the story is settling into its final passages. But before we arrive there, let us take a moment to sit with what the story actually shows us about the nature of history itself, because this is perhaps the most important lesson in everything we have been examining tonight. History as it is officially written is always, to some degree, the history of what the powerful have chosen to record. The archives that historians work from, the documents that have been preserved and catalogued and made accessible, are not neutral repositories of everything that happened. They are the products of choices about what to keep and what to discard, about what to classify as significant and what to treat as peripheral, about who gets to speak in the record and who is rendered mute. The founding families of colonial Sydney were, among other things, makers of archives. They kept records that suited their narratives. They preserved documents that supported the story they wanted to tell about themselves and their achievements. And they, or the institutions they built and shaped, made choices about what would be preserved in the public collections that historians would eventually work from. This does not mean that the historical record is simply fabricated. Most of what is preserved is genuine, and the scholarly tradition of historical research has developed methods for evaluating and interpreting that record that are genuinely valuable. But it does mean that the historical record has a shape that reflects the interests of those who were in a position to shape it, and that the gaps in the record are not random. Recognizing this does not lead to the conclusion that history is simply unknowable, or that all interpretations are equally valid. It leads, instead, to the conclusion that reading history well requires reading it against the grain, attending to what is absent as much as to what is present, asking who had the power to shape the record and what their interests were, and looking for the traces of stories that were not supposed to be told in the interstices of the stories that were. That is what we have been trying to do tonight. And the story that emerges from that kind of reading is more complex, more uncomfortable, and more illuminating than the story the official record was designed to tell. The wealthy families of colonial Sydney did not appear from nowhere. They came from somewhere. And the somewhere they came from was a world of informal power and informal capital and informal networks of commercial and political advantage that the official history of Australia has consistently underestimated or ignored. Tracing that world, as far as the evidence allows, is a step toward understanding the society that those families helped to build and that we are still living in. The story is not finished. It continues to unfold in the decisions of financial institutions and media companies and real estate developers and political parties that are, in ways that are sometimes direct and sometimes attenuated, connected to the networks and the institutional inheritances of the founding period. Understanding those connections is part of what it means to understand the present, and understanding the present is part of what it means to be a citizen of any society that takes seriously the ideal of democratic self-governance. We do not always get the history we want. We get the history that happened. But we can, if we are willing to look carefully and follow the evidence where it leads, get closer to the history that actually happened rather than the history that the powerful have preferred to tell. That is what the story of Sydney's founding families reveals, when you look at it clearly. And that is why it matters. Now let us go to a place in this story that we have been circling around for a while. The place where the history of Sydney's founding wealth connects to something even larger and even more obscure. The connections that run not just through colonial institutions and commercial networks, but through the deep history of the Pacific itself. The Pacific Ocean is the largest geographic feature on the surface of the Earth. It covers more area than all of the land on the planet combined. And for most of recorded Western history, it was a space that European civilization could not enter, let alone understand. The voyages of the late 18th century, Cook and Bougainville and La Perouse and the others, were not simply voyages of geographic discovery. They were the beginning of a process of engagement with a part of the world that had its own deep history, its own complex societies, its own patterns of trade and migration and cultural exchange that had been developing for thousands of years without any European involvement. The Aboriginal Australians, whose land became the foundation of Sydney's founding wealth, had been living in Australia for at least 65,000 years. Their relationship with the land was not the relationship of property owners in the European legal sense. It was the relationship of people whose identity and whose knowledge and whose spiritual life were constituted by their connection to specific places and specific country. The Gadigal people whose harbour became Sydney Harbour were not simply occupying territory that happened to be available. They were the custodians of a place that was, in every meaningful sense, theirs in a way that goes deeper than any title deed can capture. The Daruk and the Tharawal and the Gundungura peoples whose land became the farms and wool runs and townships of colonial New South Wales were not simply bystanders to the history of the colony's founding wealth. They were the people whose dispossession made that wealth possible, whose ecological knowledge was, in some cases, extracted by the colonists who displaced them, and whose suffering was the precondition for the prosperity that the official history celebrates. This dimension of the story, the Aboriginal dimension, is one that the official history of Sydney's founding families has consistently marginalized. The families are presented as builders of a new society in a land that was essentially empty, waiting for the application of European capital and European energy to transform it into something productive. The reality is that the land was not empty, was not unproductive, was not without its own complex systems of management and exchange, and that the transformation celebrated in the official history was achieved through the destruction of those systems and the displacement of the people who maintained them. Understanding this is not simply a matter of adding a layer of acknowledgement to the conventional story. It is a matter of recognizing that the conventional story is fundamentally misconstructed, because it begins at a point that arbitrarily excludes the prior history of the land and the prior history of the people whose dispossession is the foundation of the wealth the story celebrates. The land grants of the founding period were grants of land that had been stolen. The pastoral runs of the squatting era were occupations of land whose prior users had been forcibly displaced. The commercial wealth built on the back of colonial agriculture was wealth built on the dispossession of Aboriginal Australia, and the institutional inheritance of that wealth, which continues to shape the distribution of advantage in contemporary Australia, carries within it the structural consequences of that dispossession. This is not a claim that the founding families of Sydney were uniquely evil or uniquely responsible for the dispossession of Aboriginal Australia. The dispossession was a systemic process, enabled by the colonial state and carried out by the entire colonial population in various ways. But the founding families were the primary beneficiaries of the dispossession in the sense that they were the ones who translated the removal of Aboriginal land rights into the property holdings that became the foundation of their commercial empires. And that specific relationship between their wealth and the dispossession is something that the official history of those families has never adequately reckoned with. The mystery of where Sydney's founding families came from, and where their wealth came from, has this dimension as well. Some of the wealth came from where we have been saying, from informal power networks, from Pacific trade connections, from patron-client relationships with colonial governors, from the exploitation of asymmetric commercial relationships. But some of it came from the simple fact that 65,000 years of Aboriginal land management had produced a landscape that was, by European standards, extraordinarily productive, and that the founding families were able to claim that productivity without acknowledging, let alone compensating, the people whose knowledge and labor had produced it. This is the deepest source of the founding wealth of Sydney, deeper than the Pacific trade, deeper than the London financial connections, deeper than the patron-client relationships with colonial governors. The land itself, whose fertility and whose resources had been built and maintained by Aboriginal Australia for tens of thousands of years, was the ultimate foundation. And the mystery of how the founding families appeared from nowhere to claim it is, at its deepest level, not a mystery about the families at all. It is a question about a system of colonial accumulation that was designed to enable exactly this kind of rapid claim upon pre-existing wealth. We need to hold this dimension of the story in mind as we approach the conclusion, because it changes the character of what we have been discussing. The informal networks and the information advantages and the patron-client relationships and the Pacific trade connections are all real and all significant. But they operated within a context that was structured fundamentally by the availability of land and resources that had been taken from Aboriginal Australia. Without that foundation, the networks and connections would have had nothing to build on. Understanding the founding wealth of Sydney requires understanding this foundation as clearly as it requires understanding the commercial networks and the political connections. It requires looking at the entire structure, including the dimension that the official history has most consistently refused to examine. Let us now move toward the conclusion of this long night of investigation. We have covered an enormous amount of territory. We have traced the founding families of Sydney from their murky origins through the colonial period, through the 19th century, through the democratic challenges of the early 20th century, and into the contemporary period. We have identified the gaps in the official record, and what those gaps suggest. We have traced the informal networks that shaped the founding wealth and their institutional descendants. And we have insisted on including in the analysis the dimensions of the story that the official history prefers to leave out: the Aboriginal dispossession, the coercive labor, the asymmetric commercial relationships, the structural advantages that are reproduced across generations through institutional inheritance. What does all of this add up to? It adds up to a picture of Sydney's founding wealth that is significantly different from the pioneer narrative of the official history. In the official history, the founding families were visionaries who saw opportunity in a difficult environment and seized it through energy and intelligence and courage. In the history we have been tracing, they were participants, sometimes active and sometimes passive, in a system of colonial accumulation that was structured to enable rapid wealth concentration by those who had access to the right connections and the right information, at the expense of those who did not have those connections, and at the most fundamental level, at the expense of the Aboriginal Australians, whose land and resources were the ultimate source of the wealth. The official history celebrates the founding families. The history we have been tracing contextualizes them. Both are necessary for an adequate understanding of how Sydney came to be the city it is, and why it is distributed the way it is, and why the patterns of advantage and disadvantage that characterize contemporary Sydney have the specific character they have. But there is one more dimension of the mystery that we need to address before we conclude, because it is the dimension that gives the whole story its most contemporary relevance. The question of how Sydney's founding families appeared from nowhere in the 1800s is not just a historical question. It is a question about how wealth and power are created and maintained in any society, and the answer we have been developing throughout this story suggests something important about the current moment. In the early 21st century, we are witnessing a new episode of the same kind of rapid wealth concentration that characterized the founding period of colonial Sydney. The fortunes created in the technology sector, in financial services, in real estate in certain global cities, have been accumulated with a speed and a concentration that parallels, in striking ways, the rapid accumulation of the founding families. And the explanation for that accumulation, the conventional explanation of innovation and entrepreneurship and the rewards of the market, is inadequate in exactly the same ways that the conventional explanation of the founding family's wealth is inadequate. The contemporary fortunes have been built within a system that provides systematic advantages to those who have access to certain forms of capital, certain networks of connection, certain sources of information and legal protection that are not available to most people. The regulatory environment within which the technology sector operates has been shaped through lobbying and political connection and institutional capture in ways that benefit the major players at the expense of potential competitors. The financial instruments through which the technology sector's wealth has been monetized, the venture capital and the initial public offerings and the secondary markets for private equity, are instruments that are accessible only to those who are already inside the relevant networks. The legal structures through which the resulting wealth is held and transmitted across generations are structures that have been designed by sophisticated lawyers and accountants operating in the service of their clients' interests to maximize the preservation of that wealth against the redistributive pressures of taxation and regulation. This is the founding period of a new set of families whose descendants will look back in a century or two and wonder how the founding fortunes appeared so rapidly from what seemed like nothing. And the answer they will get from the official history of their time will be the same kind of answer we have been examining throughout this story. Innovation, vision, entrepreneurship, the rewards of market success, and the answer they will find if they look more carefully, if they trace the informal networks and the regulatory capture and the information advantages and the structural context within which that wealth was created, will be the same kind of answer we have been developing throughout this story. Systematic advantages, insider access, the conversion of informal power into formal wealth, and a structural context that enabled rapid accumulation by those who were positioned for it at the expense of those who were not. The story of Sydney's founding families is not just history. It is a template for understanding how wealth concentration works in any era, in any society that has formal democratic institutions but substantive inequality in access to the informal structures of advantage. Understanding the template in its historical form is a step toward recognizing it in its contemporary form, and recognizing it in its contemporary form is a prerequisite for thinking seriously about what, if anything, can be done about it. This is why the story matters. Not because the founding families of colonial Sydney are a uniquely interesting historical subject, though they are interesting, but because the patterns they illustrate are patterns that are still operating, that are still shaping the distribution of wealth and opportunity in Australia and in many other societies, and that will continue to do so until they are clearly seen and honestly reckoned with. We have been trying tonight to see them clearly. We have not solved the mystery of Sydney's founding wealth. We have made it more complex and more interesting than the official history suggests, and we have pointed toward the dimensions of the story that the official history has most consistently avoided. The mystery remains, in the sense that the specific mechanisms through which the founding capital moved, and the specific arrangements through which the founding connections were established, are not fully recoverable from the available evidence. But the broad outlines of the story are clearer than they were before we began, and the questions we are left with are more specific and more pointed than the questions with which we started. Where did they come from? From informal networks of commercial and political connection that operated in the spaces between official institutions. Where did the money come from? From the intersection of those networks with the opportunities created by colonial land grants, Pacific trade, coercive labor, and Aboriginal dispossession. How did they maintain their advantage? Through institutional investment, endogamous marriage networks, the control of information, and the capture of regulatory and cultural institutions that shaped the environment within which advantage was reproduced. And why has this story not been more clearly told? Because the institutions through which the story would most naturally be told, the universities and the museums and the media and the historical societies, are themselves the products of the networks whose story we have been tracing. And those networks have had, for 2 centuries, an interest in a different kind of story about their origins. That interest does not make the truth unreachable. It makes it harder to reach, and it makes the effort of reaching it more important. We have been making that effort tonight. The effort matters. The truth, however partial and imperfect our access to it may be, matters. And the questions that the truth raises about obligation and accountability and what genuine democratic equality would require of a society built on these foundations, those questions matter most of all. The story of Sydney's wealthiest families, the ones who appeared from nowhere in the 1800s, is a story that is not finished. It is a story that is still being written in the distribution of wealth and opportunity and in the patterns of advantage and disadvantage that characterize Australian society today. Understanding where it began is part of understanding where it is going, and where it needs to go if the society built on those foundations is to be genuinely rather than merely formally democratic. That is the challenge the story leaves us with, and it is a challenge that begins, as all real challenges do, with seeing clearly what is actually there. Sleep well. The questions will still be waiting in the morning. But before the darkness fully settles, there is one more thread worth pulling, one final dimension of this mystery that we have been dancing around without quite naming directly, and it deserves to be named even if it cannot be fully explained. Throughout this story, we have traced the informal networks that connected the founding families of Sydney to each other and to the larger world within which they operated. We have identified the commercial networks, the familial connections, the patron-client relationships, the institutional inheritances. We have suggested that these networks were part of a larger system of informal commercial coordination that operated across colonial boundaries and left only partial traces in the official record. But there is a question we have not directly addressed. Why Sydney? Of all the colonial contexts in which these networks were operating in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, why did Sydney become the specific location where so much of the wealth accumulation that we have been tracing was concentrated? Why not Calcutta, which was already a major commercial centre? Why not the Cape Colony, which was also part of the British imperial network? Why not Jamaica or the other Caribbean colonial contexts? The answer has several dimensions, some of them obvious and some of them less so. The obvious dimensions are geographic and commercial. Sydney's position at the edge of the Pacific made it a natural node in the trade networks that were opening that ocean to commercial exploitation. Its deep harbour made it an ideal resupply point for the long-distance voyages that the Pacific trade required. Its distance from established European commercial centres meant that commercial operations based there had a degree of autonomy and a degree of freedom from official oversight that was not available in more established colonial contexts. But there is a less obvious dimension that is worth considering, and it has to do with the specific timing of Sydney's founding and the specific context of British imperial politics in the late 18th century. Sydney was founded at a moment of unusual opportunity for the kind of informal commercial networks we have been tracing. The American Revolution had disrupted established commercial patterns. The beginning of the Napoleonic Wars was creating both opportunities and risks in European and Atlantic trade. The established colonial commercial networks in the Caribbean and in India were becoming increasingly regulated and increasingly competitive. And the Pacific was genuinely open, in the sense that no established commercial power had yet asserted effective control over it. Into this moment, the British government planted a colony at Sydney Cove that was officially a penal settlement, but that was structurally positioned to become something else. A base from which informal commercial networks could extend into the Pacific without the regulatory oversight that would have constrained them in more established colonial contexts. Whether this positioning was deliberate, whether someone in the British government in the late 18th century actually planned for Sydney to serve this function, or whether it was simply the unintended consequence of a decision made primarily for penal and strategic reasons, is a question that the available evidence does not fully answer. But the functional outcome is clear. Sydney became, within its first decade of existence, exactly this kind of base. The men who built its founding commercial wealth used it as a platform from which informal networks operating in the Pacific could be extended and exploited in ways that would have been much more difficult from any other base in the British imperial system at that time. Understanding Sydney this way, not simply as a colonial settlement, but as a commercial platform for a specific kind of informal Pacific trade, changes the character of the question we have been asking about the founding wealth. The question is no longer simply why these specific men accumulated so much so quickly. The question becomes why Sydney was the location from which that accumulation was possible, and what that tells us about the larger commercial and imperial networks within which Sydney's founding was embedded. The answer that the evidence suggests is that Sydney was a purpose-made opportunity, whether that purpose was conscious or not, for commercial actors who were operating at the edges of the formal imperial commercial system and who needed a location where the informal dimensions of their operations could function with minimal official interference. The distance from established commercial centers, the official preoccupation of the colonial administration with the management of convicts and the maintenance of basic order, the relative weakness of customs and regulatory oversight in a settlement that was struggling to feed itself, all of these factors created conditions that were, from the perspective of informal commercial networks, almost ideal. The founding families of Sydney recognized these conditions and exploited them. And the wealth they accumulated in doing so was not simply personal wealth. It was the accumulated return on the use of a specific commercial platform at a specific moment of historical opportunity. This is, when you think about it, a remarkably clear story, once you have assembled the pieces. The mystery of Sydney's founding wealth is not, ultimately, that mysterious. It is the story of informal commercial networks using a specific geographic and institutional platform at a specific moment of historical opportunity to accumulate wealth in ways that the official record was not designed to capture. And the reason the mystery persists, the reason the official history has never told this story clearly, is that the institutions through which the official history is told were built by the people whose networks we have been tracing, and those people had every reason to prefer a different story about their origins. The pioneer narrative, the story of vision and enterprise, and the creation of something from nothing, serves the interest of those who benefit from the founding wealth by obscuring the specific mechanisms through which it was created. It makes the wealth look like the natural and deserved outcome of individual effort, rather than the structural outcome of informal networks and institutional advantages and the exploitation of specific historical opportunities. Replacing that narrative with a more accurate account does not diminish the genuine achievements of the founding period. People did build things. Industries were created, cities were constructed. A complex society emerged where there had been, from the European perspective, wilderness. These are real facts, and they deserve acknowledgement. But acknowledging them within an accurate account of the structural conditions that made them possible, including the informal networks and the dispossession and the coercive labor and the asymmetric trade, is a significantly different thing from celebrating them within a narrative that naturalizes the specific distribution of the benefits. That is the distinction that matters. And making that distinction requires telling the story we have been telling tonight, the story of how Sydney's wealthiest families actually appeared in the 1800s and why nobody questions it. We have questioned it. We have found the story more complex, more interesting, more uncomfortable, and more illuminating than the official version. And we leave you with the questions that the complex version raises, because those questions matter for anyone who lives in the society that was built on these foundations. Where does wealth actually come from? What structures of informal power enable its accumulation? How does it reproduce itself across generations? What are the obligations of those who benefit from structural advantages to those who bear the corresponding structural disadvantages? And what would it actually mean to build a society that was genuinely rather than merely formally committed to equal opportunity? These are not comfortable questions. They have no easy answers. But they are the questions that the history of Sydney's founding wealth actually poses, when you look at it clearly enough to see what it actually shows. The stars are still overhead. The harbour is still there. The city is still built on the land that was granted and grabbed and accumulated in the founding period. And the patterns that were established then are still visible to those who know how to look in the distribution of wealth and power and opportunity in contemporary Sydney. Seeing those patterns is the beginning of understanding them, and understanding them is the beginning of knowing what, if anything, to do about them. That is where the story leaves us. Not with answers, but with clearer questions. Not with resolution, but with better vision. And sometimes, better vision is the most important thing a long night of looking can give you. Rest now. The harbour is quiet. The city sleeps on its complicated foundations. And the story, incomplete as it always is, has gone as far as tonight's telling can take it. But the mystery, the real mystery of how power works and how wealth is created, and who benefits from the structures that organize both, that mystery is as alive as it has ever been. It is the mystery of the present dressed in the clothing of the past. And it deserves the kind of attention we have been giving it tonight, and more. What you carry out of this story matters. Carry the questions. Carry the awareness that the official history is always partial, always shaped by the interests of those with the power to shape it. Carry the practice of looking for the gaps, for the places where the story goes quiet at exactly the moment it should be speaking loudest. Carry the understanding that wealth and power do not appear from nowhere, even when the official history presents them as if they do. And carry the knowledge that the story of Sydney's founding families is not a historical curiosity. It is a live wire, connected to the present, running through the institutions and the distributions and the patterns of advantage and disadvantage that constitute the society you actually live in. It was always a live wire. It is just that most of the time, nobody tells you to look for it. We looked tonight, we found something, and what we found matters. Sleep well, ask questions, follow the evidence where it leads. And remember that the history that has been hidden from you is often the history that matters most for understanding where you are. The founding families of Sydney appeared from nowhere. Now you know that nowhere had an address. It had names and networks, and specific mechanisms, and specific victims. And the wealth that appeared from that nowhere is still here, still shaping things, still demanding to be understood. The story is not over. It never is. But tonight, we have made it a little clearer, a little more visible, a little more honest. That is enough, for now. Let the night settle around you. Let the questions rest where they are. The story will be here when you return to it, with the same gaps and the same patterns and the same invitation to look more carefully than the official version wants you to look. We have been looking carefully tonight. We have found what careful looking always finds. Not simple answers, but better questions. And the sense that those questions are worth asking, and the awareness that asking them is itself a form of resistance to the power that prefers to leave them unasked. That resistance matters. It has always mattered. And it begins with the willingness to look at the history we have been given and ask the question that has always been right there, waiting to be asked. How did they appear from nowhere? Now you know the beginning of the answer. The rest is yours to find. Good night. The harbor holds its secrets and its stories, and both are worth knowing. The founding wealth is still here, still visible in the city's bones, still teaching anyone willing to read it what it has to teach about power and accumulation and the structures that organize both. Read it carefully. The lesson is important, and it is, in the end, about all of us. About the society we live in, the wealth that shapes it, and the questions we are willing to ask about where both came from. Ask the questions. Follow the evidence. See the story clearly. That is all that is asked of you tonight, and it is everything. There is something we have not yet fully addressed in this long night of tracing and questioning, and it is the specific texture of everyday life in colonial Sydney for the people who were not among the founding families and their networks. Because the story of how the wealthy few accumulated their advantage is inseparable from the story of the many for whom no such accumulation was possible, and understanding the contrast is essential for understanding what the founding wealth actually was. The Sydney of 1810, of 1820, of 1830 was a place of profound and visible inequality. It was a small town by the standards of any European city, but within its small compass, the contrast between the conditions of the privileged and the conditions of the rest was as stark as anywhere in the British world. The emancipist population, the men and women who had served their sentences and been released into the colony, constituted one of the most interesting and most neglected groups in the social history of early Sydney. They were the majority of the adult population in the early decades. They had served time, often for offences that reflected the profound inequality of the British legal system, offences that were defined as crimes precisely because the property arrangements they violated were arrangements that served the interests of the propertied class. Stealing cloth in a Lancashire mill town, taking food in conditions of near starvation, poaching on land that had been enclosed from common use within living memory. These were the offences that had sent most of the convicts to New South Wales, and they reflected not individual moral failure, but structural inequality. In the colony, emancipists found themselves in a social position that was defined primarily by their former status as convicts, regardless of what they had done before their sentence or what they had achieved since. The distinctions between emancipists and free settlers, between those who had come to the colony in chains and those who had come voluntarily, shaped every aspect of colonial social life in ways that had little to do with actual capability or actual contribution, and much to do with the specific form of social status that the colonial hierarchy had inherited from British class, society, and adapted to colonial conditions. Simeon Lord, whom we discussed earlier as one of the most extraordinary success stories of the emancipist class, was exceptional precisely because he was an exception. For every Simeon Lord who managed to leverage whatever combination of talent and luck and connection allowed him to break through the social barriers, there were hundreds of emancipists who remained in conditions of relative poverty and social marginalization throughout their colonial lives, working as laborers or small farmers or domestic servants in the households of the free settler class that had the social advantages they lacked. The specific mechanism through which the social barrier between emancipists and free settlers was maintained is worth examining in some detail, because it illustrates with unusual clarity how informal social hierarchies can reproduce themselves through institutional means, even when there is no official legal basis for the hierarchy. In the formal legal structure of the colony, emancipists who had served their sentences were legally free. They could vote, could own property, could enter into contracts, could in principle participate in the full range of colonial, commercial, and social life. Governor Macquarie, in the period from 1810 to 1821, made a deliberate effort to promote emancipists to positions of social respectability, appointing them to the bench of magistrates and to other official positions in ways that asserted their formal equality with free settlers. This effort was fiercely resisted by the free settler class, and the resistance was not primarily on legal grounds, but on social grounds, on the grounds that the distinction between the convict and the non-convict was a distinction of fundamental social worth that no legal technicality could efface. The controversy over Macquarie's emancipist policy was one of the defining political conflicts of the early colonial period, and it illuminates something important about how social hierarchies persist even when their formal bases have been removed. The free settler class maintained the distinction through the mechanisms of social exclusion that do not require legal enforcement and cannot be challenged in courts. The refusal of social invitations, the exclusion from certain establishments and certain social occasions, the informal signals of contempt and condescension that communicate clearly, without explicit statement, who belongs in the circle and who does not. These mechanisms were effective precisely because they operated in the social domain, where the formal equality of legal status was irrelevant, and where the informal hierarchy was reproduced daily through the micro-practices of social life. The emancipist class responded to this exclusion in ways that are themselves instructive. Those with sufficient resources, like Simeon Lord, invested in the physical markers of respectability, in stone houses and fine furniture and elaborate social entertaining that asserted their claim to the status the free settlers denied them. Those without such resources generally accepted the subordinate position they were assigned, not because they lacked the desire for something better, but because the mechanisms of exclusion were sufficiently effective and the resources for challenging them were sufficiently scarce that the practical calculation of what was achievable was genuinely constrained. This dynamic, the maintenance of social hierarchy through informal mechanisms of exclusion against the background of formal legal equality, is a pattern that repeats throughout the history we have been tracing. It is visible in the treatment of emancipists. It is visible in the treatment of the Chinese miners during the Gold Rush era, who faced systematic social and eventually legal discrimination, despite their significant contribution to the colonial economy. It is visible in the treatment of the Aboriginal Australians whose land the entire colonial enterprise was built on, who were progressively marginalized and excluded from the colonial society that was constructed on their country. And it is visible in the contemporary patterns of advantage and disadvantage that the official narrative attributes to market forces and individual merit. In each case, formal legal equality coexists with substantive social inequality reproduced through informal mechanisms that the formal equality leaves untouched. And in each case, the informal mechanisms serve the specific function of protecting the advantages of those who are already inside the privileged circle from the competitive pressure of those who are outside it, but who would, if genuinely equal access were available, be capable of competing effectively. The founding wealth of Sydney was built within this structure, and it was built in ways that reinforced the structure rather than challenging it. The emancipist exceptions, the simian lords who managed to break through, were exceptions that the system could absorb without threatening its basic logic. They were incorporated into the commercial networks on terms that reflected their junior status within those networks, that gave them access to commercial opportunity while maintaining the social distinction that legitimated the network's internal hierarchy. This is how informal social hierarchies absorb exceptional individuals without being disrupted by them. The exceptional individual is incorporated. Their exceptionality is celebrated as evidence that the hierarchy is not truly closed, and the basic structure of the hierarchy remains intact. The simian lord story, in this reading, is not evidence that the colonial social hierarchy was open and meritocratic. It is evidence that the colonial social hierarchy was sufficiently flexible to incorporate exceptional individuals without threatening its essential structure. Now let us return once more to the question of the specific founding families and their specific trajectories, because there are dimensions of some of those trajectories that we have not yet examined, and that add further complexity to the picture. The case of the MacArthur family is worth returning to, because the family's long history in New South Wales allows us to trace the institutional mechanisms of elite reproduction with unusual clarity. The MacArthur estates in the Camden district were not simply commercial operations. They were, from very early in their history, the nucleus of a specific kind of social institution. The great station, the pastoral property that was a world unto itself, with its own internal hierarchy, its own dependent population, its own forms of authority and obligation. The workers on the MacArthur estates, the convict labourers, and later the free labourers who tended the sheep and worked the fields and maintained the buildings, were connected to the MacArthur family through relationships that were not simply commercial. They were relationships of patronage and dependence that had both economic and social dimensions, in which the MacArthur family provided employment and housing, and in some cases a degree of social protection in return for labour and loyalty that went beyond what a purely commercial employment relationship would have required. This is not a uniquely Australian phenomenon. The great estate system that characterised the pastoral districts of New South Wales in the 19th century was a version of a social institution that had existed, in various forms, throughout the history of European agriculture: the manorial estate, the plantation, the hacienda. All of these institutions combined commercial function with social function, creating relationships between landowners and their dependent workers that were simultaneously economic and social, simultaneously commercial and political. What is specific to the Australian colonial context is the way in which this social institution was built, with remarkable speed, in a setting that had no prior tradition of the kind of settled agricultural society within which such institutions usually develop. The founding families of Sydney built their versions of the great estate in the first decades of the colony's existence, using a combination of granted land, assigned convict labour, and informal social influence to create the social infrastructure of a landed gentry before the economic infrastructure to support such a gentry was fully in place. This is a remarkable achievement in a strictly sociological sense, and it tells you something important about the capabilities and the intentions of the men who accomplished it. They were not simply trying to make money in a new commercial environment. They were trying to establish a specific kind of social order, one modelled on the landed social hierarchies of the British Isles, in a context where the raw materials of such an order, the established estates, the dependent tenant farmers, the centuries of customary relationship between landowners and their people, were all absent. That they succeeded in establishing it as quickly as they did is a testament to their social and political intelligence, and it is also evidence that they had access to resources and to models and to forms of backing that made the rapid establishment of this social order possible. The great estates of the founding families were not simply farms. They were social projects, and they required social as well as commercial investment to build. The social investment came, in significant part, from the patron-client relationships we have been tracing throughout this story. The governor who granted the land provided the foundation. The connections to the Colonial Office in London that protected the grants from challenge provided the security. The access to assigned convict labour through the Labour Bureau that provided the workforce. And the informal social networks that allowed the founding families to establish themselves as the social leaders of the colonial community, the arbiters of respectability and the dispensers of patronage, provided the social legitimacy that the estates needed to function as social institutions rather than merely as commercial operations. All of this required capital. Some of it required money. More of it required the kind of social and political capital that we have been calling informal power throughout this story. And the founding families had access to that informal power through mechanisms that the official record does not document clearly, but that the pattern of outcomes makes visible. Let us now turn to one of the most interesting and least discussed aspects of the founding period, the role of women in the informal networks that shaped the founding wealth. The official history of colonial Sydney is almost entirely a history of men. The founding families are identified by their male heads: John MacArthur, Simeon Lord, Robert Campbell, Darcy Wentworth. The women of these families appear in the official record, primarily as wives and mothers, as markers of social respectability, as the producers of the heirs who would carry the family name and the family wealth into the next generation. But there is a different history, visible at the edges of the official record, in which women played a significantly more active role in the informal networks that shaped the founding wealth. Elizabeth MacArthur, the wife of John, is the clearest example. Her letters and diaries, which are preserved in the Mitchell Library and which have been examined by several feminist historians, reveal a woman of extraordinary intelligence and practical capability who managed the Elizabeth Farm operation during the extended periods when her husband was away in England or engaged in political controversies. She made commercial decisions, managed the labor force, corresponded with merchants and suppliers, and in several critical periods was effectively the operational leader of the enterprise that the official history names after her husband. But Elizabeth MacArthur's role was not simply that of a substitute manager filling in for an absent principal. Her correspondence reveals active participation in the informal social networks that shaped the commercial and political environment within which the family's enterprise operated. She cultivated relationships with the wives and daughters of other significant colonial families. She managed the family's social obligations and social reputation in ways that were commercially as well as socially consequential. She was, in other words, a significant actor in the informal networks that we have been tracing, even though the official record, which was built around the formal commercial and political institutions from which women were excluded, renders her largely invisible. This pattern, women playing significant roles in the informal social networks that shaped the founding wealth, while being excluded from the formal institutions through which that wealth was officially managed, appears to be general rather than specific to the MacArthur case. The wives and daughters of the founding families were the primary managers of the social relationships, the dinner parties and the church committees and the charitable activities and the visiting and the correspondence through which the informal networks maintained themselves. They were the connective tissue of the networks, and their work was essential to the network's functioning, even though it was not recognized or compensated in any way that appears in the official record. Understanding this dimension of the founding networks is important both for a complete account of how those networks actually functioned and for a more accurate understanding of the gendered dimensions of the founding wealth. The wealth was built by men, in the sense that the formal, commercial, and political actors were men, but it was maintained, in significant part, by the social work of women, work that was unrewarded in the official accounting, but that was essential to the reproduction of the informal networks within which the wealth was embedded. This is another dimension of the story that the official history has not adequately reckoned with. The story of the founding families is, in the conventional telling, a story of individual male enterprise. It is, more accurately, a story of informal social networks in which women played essential roles that are invisible in the official record, but visible in the private correspondence and the social histories that have been only partially examined. Recovering that dimension of the story is a project that requires the same kind of attention to the gaps in the official record that we have been applying throughout this analysis. The gaps are real, the women are in them, and finding them changes the story in ways that are as important as any of the other revisions we have been making to the conventional account. Let us now think about what we want to carry forward from this long night of exploration, what the story of Sydney's founding families ultimately teaches us that is worth remembering. It teaches us that wealth does not simply appear. Even when the official history presents it as appearing from nowhere, it has sources, and those sources are worth tracing. The sources may be informal and may be deliberately obscured by the official record, but they are real and they are discoverable if you look carefully enough at the gaps and patterns in what the official record does preserve. It teaches us that informal power is real power, and that understanding how power actually operates requires looking beyond the formal institutional structures that are visible in the official record to the informal networks of connection and information and capital that shape what the formal institutions do and who benefits from them. It teaches us that the specific distribution of wealth in any society at any moment is not the natural outcome of market forces and individual merit. It is the outcome of specific historical processes in which some actors had access to structural advantages that others did not, and in which those advantages were reproduced through institutional mechanisms that the passage of time tends to make less visible but not less real. And it teaches us that telling the true story of those historical processes, as completely and as honestly as the evidence allows, is not simply an academic exercise. It is an act of democratic accountability, of insisting that the foundations of the society we live in are visible enough to be honestly reckoned with, rather than celebrated uncritically. These are the lessons that the story of Sydney's founding families teaches. They are not comfortable lessons, and they do not lead to simple conclusions about what should be done. But they are honest lessons, grounded in the actual history as closely as we have been able to trace it. And honest lessons, even when they are uncomfortable, are the foundation on which anything worth building must be built. The mystery of Sydney's founding families was never truly mysterious. It was simply a mystery that nobody with the power to investigate it had much interest in solving. We have taken a few steps tonight toward the solution, not far enough to claim the whole answer, but far enough to see clearly that there is an answer, that it is different from the official story, and that finding it matters. The harbour is still out there, quiet in the early hours. The city is built on its shores, on the land that was granted and grabbed and accumulated in the founding period, on the commercial networks that moved through that harbour in the early decades of the 19th century, on the informal structures of power that shaped which families benefited from the opportunities of the colonial period and which did not. The city is still those things, still built on those foundations, still shaped by those patterns, still telling, in its distribution of wealth and opportunity and advantage, the story of how it came to be. Now you know more of that story than you did when we began. And knowing more of it, you can see the city and the society it is part of a little more clearly. That clarity is worth something. It is worth the long night we have spent pursuing it. It is worth the discomfort of the story we have told. It is, in the end, the beginning of understanding. And understanding is the beginning of everything else. Sleep well. The city holds its secrets and its stories, and now you carry a few more of them than you did before. That is not nothing. In a society that prefers its myths to its history, choosing to understand the history is already a form of resistance, a step toward a kind of civic clarity that the power structures would prefer you not to achieve. You have achieved a little of it tonight. More is possible, and the story invites you to pursue it. The founding families appeared from nowhere. Now you know a little more about where nowhere was. That knowledge belongs to you. Keep it, use it, and let it make you a more honest and a more clear-eyed reader of the world you actually live in. Good night and good morning, whenever it comes. The story continues. It always does. And now you are part of it, with eyes a little more open than before. That is enough for tonight, more than enough. Rest, dream. And tomorrow, look at the world with the clarity this long night has offered. It is a gift, this clarity. Small, imperfect, partial, but real. Real enough to matter, real enough to carry forward, real enough to share. The harbour holds its secrets. The city holds its history. And you hold, now, a little more of both. Sleep well. The story will be here when you return to it, waiting with the same patience that history always brings to those willing to look at it honestly. Take the time, look honestly, carry what you find. That is all anyone can ask. That is all this story asks of you. Good night. There is one more pass we need to make through this material, because in a story this long and this layered, there are always threads that were touched but not followed far enough, questions that were raised but not fully examined, dimensions of the mystery that deserve more attention than the flow of the narrative has allowed. Let us spend some time with those threads now, because they deepen the story in ways that matter. The question of the role of religion in the founding networks of colonial Sydney is one that the conventional history addresses primarily through the story of the churches as social institutions, as markers of respectability, and as providers of the moral legitimacy that the colonial hierarchy needed to function without constant resort to naked force. This is a real and important dimension of the story. The Church of England, in particular, was deeply embedded in the social networks of the free settler elite, and the distinction between Anglican and other denominations was, in the early colonial period, a significant social marker that tracked closely with the hierarchy between emancipists and free settlers, and between different tiers of the free settler class itself. But religion in the founding period was not simply a social institution. It was also, for a significant portion of the colonial population, a genuinely live intellectual and spiritual commitment, and the ways in which those commitments intersected with the commercial and political dynamics of the colony are more complex than the simple story of church as social institution suggests. The Catholic population of early colonial New South Wales, which was primarily Irish in origin and which was heavily concentrated among the convict class, occupied a peculiar position in the colonial social hierarchy. They were excluded from the full social network of the Anglican elite by their religious identity as well as by their class and convict origin, but they had their own internal networks of connection and mutual support that were, in some respects, more effective than the Anglican social networks for certain kinds of collective action. The Irish networks of colonial Sydney were the networks that would eventually produce the labour movement and the Catholic political organisations that challenged the Anglo-Protestant commercial elite in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But in the founding period, they were primarily defensive networks, focused on the preservation of community and the mutual support of a group that was doubly marginalised by class and by religion. The story of these Irish Catholic networks in colonial Sydney is a story that runs in parallel to the story of the founding commercial elite, sometimes intersecting with it, and sometimes in direct opposition to it, and it is a story that the official history has, for reasons that probably reflect the class and religious biases of those who have written that history, tended to marginalize relative to the story of the Anglo-Protestant founding families. Recovering that parallel story would require more than one night's telling. But acknowledging it here is important for the completeness of the picture, because the distribution of wealth and advantage in colonial Sydney was not simply a matter of some people having the right connections and others not. It was also a matter of specific groups being systematically excluded from certain networks and certain opportunities by religious and ethnic identity, as well as by class and legal status, and that systematic exclusion is part of what shaped the specific distribution of wealth that we see in the historical record. The story of the Chinese communities in colonial and post-colonial New South Wales is another parallel narrative that the official history of the founding wealth tends to neglect. The Chinese presence in New South Wales dates to the gold rush of the 1850s, and the experience of Chinese Australians in the second half of the 19th century and through much of the 20th was characterized by systematic discrimination. That is one of the ugliest chapters in Australian social history. The anti-Chinese riots of the 1850s and 1860s, the various restriction acts culminating in the White Australia policy, the decades of legal exclusion from the full rights of citizenship that persisted well into the 20th century. But within these conditions of systematic exclusion, Chinese Australians built commercial networks that were, in certain niches of the colonial and post-colonial economy, highly effective. The market gardening networks, the small commercial networks in the cities, the informal financial networks within the community, these were all expressions of the same basic principle that we have been tracking through the story of the founding elite. That commercial success in conditions of uncertainty and incomplete markets depends on access to information and trust networks that extend beyond the formal commercial institutions. The difference between the Chinese commercial networks and the Anglo-Protestant commercial elite networks was not the principle but the context. The Chinese networks operated under conditions of legal and social discrimination that the Anglo-Protestant networks did not face. They were excluded from the formal institutions through which commercial advantage was reproduced in the dominant society, and they had to build alternative informal institutions to serve the same functions. Understanding the Chinese-Australian commercial experience alongside the experience of the founding Anglo-Protestant elite illuminates, by contrast, how much of the founding elite's success depended on the specific advantages of operating within the dominant social network rather than outside it. The Chinese-Australian entrepreneurs who built successful commercial operations in colonial and post-colonial New South Wales were, in many cases, as capable and as energetic as the founding families of the Anglo-Protestant elite. What they lacked was not capability, but the structural advantages of being inside the dominant network, the access to government contracts, the legal protections, the access to credit from institutions that were shaped by the values and relationships of the dominant social group, the social legitimacy that allowed their commercial activities to be treated as legitimate rather than suspicious. This contrast is important because it is, in a sense, the experimental control that demonstrates the significance of the structural advantages we have been analyzing. If the founding wealth of Sydney's Anglo-Protestant elite were primarily a function of individual capability and entrepreneurial vision, you would expect to see comparable wealth creation among other capable and entrepreneurial groups operating in the same environment. But you do not. You see, instead, the systematic advantage of those inside the dominant network and the systematic disadvantage of those outside it, a pattern that is much more consistent with structural advantage as the primary driver than with individual merit. The lesson is clear, though the official history has consistently preferred not to draw it. Let us now spend some time with the physical geography of colonial Sydney, because the spatial organization of the early city reflects, in ways that are both literal and metaphorical, the social and commercial structures we have been analyzing. The area around Sydney Cove, where the First Fleet anchored in 1788, is one of the most significant pieces of commercial real estate in contemporary Australia. The land that surrounds the harbour, the foreshores, and the ridgelines and the valleys is now among the most expensive and most desirable in the country. But the distribution of that contemporary value is not random. It reflects, in significant part, the land grants of the colonial period, the patterns of occupation and development that were established in the first decades of the colony, and the subsequent histories of those properties through the 19th century and into the 20th. The specific areas of Sydney that are most valuable today are, disproportionately, the areas that were granted to or occupied by the founding families in the early colonial period. This is not entirely surprising, since the founding families had both the incentive and the ability to choose the best available land when it was being distributed. But it is a pattern that is worth making explicit, because it illustrates in the most concrete possible way the long-term consequences of the land distribution decisions of the founding period. The harbour foreshores that are now the location of Sydney's most expensive residential suburbs were, in the colonial period, the land that the founding families either received as grants or acquired through the commercial processes we have been analysing. The areas that were left for the poorer colonists and for the emancipist class were the less valuable inland areas, the areas that were further from the harbour, that had less access to water, that were on soil that was less productive. The spatial consequences of those founding period distributions have compounded through the subsequent 2 centuries in ways that have amplified rather than reduced the original inequality. The harbour foreshore land that was granted to the founding families has appreciated in value at rates that have consistently exceeded inflation and that have consistently exceeded the appreciation of the less valuable areas where the non-elite colonial population settled. The wealth generated by that appreciation has flowed, through the inheritance and investment mechanisms we have been analysing, to the successes of the founding families and to the institutional investors who have acquired stakes in those areas through the financial instruments developed in the 20th century. The spatial inequality of contemporary Sydney, the enormous gap in property values between the harbour-adjacent suburbs and the outer western suburbs, where Sydney's lower-income population is concentrated, is not the natural outcome of the housing market operating in neutral conditions. It is the accumulated result of 2 centuries of property value dynamics that were set in motion by the specific land distribution decisions of the founding colonial period. Understanding that connection, tracing the line from the land grants of Governor Phillip and Governor Macquarie to the contemporary property market, is another way of making the long-term consequences of the founding period's wealth distribution visible. It is also a way of making visible the contemporary stakes of the questions we have been asking throughout this story. The question of where Sydney's founding wealth came from is not merely historical, because the wealth itself is not merely historical. It is present in the form of the property values and the institutional inheritances and the network advantages that continue to shape who gets what in contemporary Sydney. And making that presence visible, connecting it to its historical origins, is part of what it means to understand the society honestly, rather than simply accepting the stories it tells about itself. Now let us take the last step in the analysis, the step that connects everything we have been examining to the largest framing questions of the contemporary moment. We live in a period in which the questions of inequality, of structural advantage and structural disadvantage, of the relationship between historical injustice and present obligation, are more politically salient than they have been at any time in the recent past. These questions are being asked in the specific contexts of racial justice movements, of indigenous rights movements, of economic inequality movements, of the politics of historical reparations and reconciliation. The story of Sydney's founding wealth is relevant to all of these conversations. It illustrates in specific historical terms the mechanisms through which the structural inequalities that contemporary movements are responding to were established. It makes visible the specific processes, the land grants, the convict labor, the Aboriginal dispossession, the Pacific trade asymmetries, through which the advantages that persist in the present were initially created. And it suggests that addressing contemporary inequality requires understanding those historical mechanisms rather than treating the present distribution of wealth and advantage as the natural and therefore legitimate outcome of market, processes, and individual merit. Markets and individual merit are real things. They are part of the story, but they are not the whole story. And treating them as the whole story is a way of making the current distribution of advantage appear more natural and more justified than it actually is. The founding families of Sydney did not create their wealth from nothing. They created it within specific structures of informal power and colonial advantage that gave them access to opportunities and resources that were not available to most of the people who were also in the colony and who were also trying to build lives. Acknowledging this is not about guilt or blame or the assignment of individual moral responsibility. It is about accuracy, about understanding the actual history clearly enough to think about the present honestly. And thinking about the present honestly, in light of the history we have been tracing, is what the story of Sydney's founding families ultimately requires of us. Not as a historical conclusion, but as a contemporary challenge. The challenge is to see clearly, to ask the questions that the official story does not ask, to follow the evidence where it leads, rather than where the official narrative wants it to go, to understand the structural foundations of the present in the specific historical processes of the past, and to carry that understanding into the conversations about what a genuinely just society would look like and what it would require. Those are large conversations, and they extend well beyond what any one night's exploration can resolve. But they begin with clarity about the history, with the willingness to ask where the money came from, and follow the answer wherever it goes, even when it goes to places that the official history has preferred not to visit. We have been going to those places tonight. We have found things there that change the story, that make it more complex and more honest and more worth understanding. And we leave you with the invitation to continue the exploration, to take the questions we have been asking and carry them forward into your own investigations of the specific historical materials and the contemporary institutional landscapes that the founding period has bequeathed to us. The story is not complete. It never is. History is always an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, and the most important conversations are the ones that the present has been reluctant to have. We have had one tonight. It is a beginning. What comes next is yours to find. The city sleeps on its complicated foundations. The harbour holds its silence and its secrets. And the story of how the wealthiest families in Sydney appeared from nowhere in the 1800s is a little less mysterious than it was when we began, and a great deal more interesting. That is what a long night of honest looking can give you. Take it. It is offered freely, without condition, and use it in whatever way seems most honest and most useful to you, as you move through a world that contains within it, always, more history than the official accounts have ever been willing to tell. Good night, and good morning. Wherever you are listening from tonight, you are part of a much longer story than any one night can contain. And that story, in all its complexity and all its difficulty and all its unresolved questions, is worth the time it takes to understand it. You have given it that time tonight. That matters. Rest well. There is something worth saying about the silence that settles around stories like this one. Not the comfortable silence of resolution, where all the threads have been tied and all the questions have been answered, but the specific silence of a story that has opened more territory than it has mapped, that has made visible the edges of things without fully illuminating what lies beyond those edges. That is the kind of silence we are in right now, and it deserves attention, because it is not an empty silence. It is full of the things we have found tonight, and the things that remain to be found, full of the questions that have been sharpened by the telling, and the ones that have been newly raised by it, full of the awareness that the story of Sydney's founding families is the kind of story that does not arrive at a clean conclusion, because the history it describes is not yet concluded. The land is still there. The families, or rather their institutional successors, are still there. The patterns of advantage and disadvantage are still being reproduced through the mechanisms we have been analyzing. The informal networks, in their contemporary forms, are still operating. The structural advantages of being inside rather than outside are still accruing to the inside. None of this changed tonight, but the visibility of it changed. And visibility is not a small thing. In democratic societies, the capacity for citizens to see clearly the structures that shape their lives is one of the most important preconditions for the kind of political agency that democracy promises but does not automatically deliver. Seeing clearly requires accurate information. It requires historical context. It requires the willingness to follow complexity rather than resting in the comfortable simplifications of official narratives. And it requires the specific kind of courage that is required not for dramatic action, but for sustained honest attention to things that are more comfortable to ignore. That is the courage this story asks of you, not the dramatic courage of whistleblowers or revolutionaries. The quieter courage of sustained attention, of asking questions that do not have satisfying answers, of living with the discomfort of knowing that the society you are part of is built on foundations that do not match the stories it tells about itself. That courage is harder to sustain than it is to imagine, because the pull toward the comfortable narrative, toward the story that celebrates the founders and naturalizes the present distribution of wealth and advantage, is strong and constant. It is built into the institutions, into the media, into the school curriculum, into the everyday social practices through which the official story is reproduced and maintained. But it is worth sustaining, worth the effort and the discomfort. Because the alternative, accepting the official story and operating within the world it describes, means accepting a version of the world that is not accurate, and operating on the basis of inaccurate understanding is, in the long run, more costly than the short-run comfort it provides. The founding families of Sydney are worth knowing accurately. The society they built is worth understanding honestly. The contemporary world that is their legacy is worth seeing clearly. And the clarity this long night of looking has contributed, however partially and imperfectly, is worth the time it has taken. Now, let the night settle. Let the questions rest where they are. Let the story be what it is. Incomplete, honest, pointing toward things that need to be pursued further, but sufficient for tonight. The harbour is still out there, the city is still built on its shores, and the history that shaped both is a little more visible now than it was when we began. That is the gift tonight has offered. Take it, hold it, and use it wisely. The story of Sydney's wealthiest families, the ones who appeared from nowhere in the 1800s and built the institutional foundations of everything that came after, is a story about power and capital, and the specific mechanisms through which advantage is created and reproduced. It is a story about what is visible in the official record and what is not, about the gaps that tell you as much as the documents, about the informal structures that operate in the spaces between the formal institutions. It is, in the end, a story about how the world actually works, rather than how we are told it works. And stories about how the world actually works are among the most valuable things that a night of honest inquiry can produce. We have produced something of that value tonight, imperfect and incomplete as it is. We leave you with it. Sleep well, dream honestly, and wake to a world that, if you carry tonight's clarity into your morning, looks a little different from how it looked before. Different in the right direction. More honest. More complex. More worth understanding. That is everything this story can offer. It offers it freely. The rest is yours. Good night, from wherever this voice reaches you, at whatever hour this reaches you, in whatever place you have made your temporary home, in the long story of human movement across this planet. The founding families of Sydney had their moment in history. It is past and yet not past, because the structures they built are still present. Understanding that paradox, holding both the pastness and the presence of the founding period simultaneously, is the beginning of the kind of historical consciousness that democracy requires of its citizens. You have that beginning now. Carry it forward. The story continues. It always does. And your part in it is larger than any official narrative has suggested. That is the truth underneath all the other truths tonight has offered. Remember it. Good night. One final thing, before this long night of looking comes fully to its close. We started with a simple observation that turned out to be not simple at all, that Sydney's wealthiest families appeared from nowhere in the 1800s, and that nobody questions it. We have spent this entire night questioning it. We have found that the nowhere had an address, that the appearance had mechanisms, that the mystery was not truly mysterious, but was instead the product of a story told in ways that made certain questions difficult to ask and certain answers difficult to find. But there is a more personal dimension to this story that deserves acknowledgement in these final moments. For most people who encounter the history of colonial Sydney, the founding families are not personal figures. They are remote historical actors whose significance is institutional and social rather than individual. You did not know John MacArthur. You have no personal relationship with the history of Elizabeth Farm or the Camden Estates. The story we have been telling tonight is the story of people and events that are separated from your immediate life by 2 centuries of time and by the vast social distance between the founding families and the ordinary people who constituted the bulk of the colonial population and who are the ancestors of the majority of contemporary Australians. But the story is personal, in a deeper sense than direct lineage. Because the patterns we have been tracing, the conversion of informal power into formal wealth, the maintenance of that wealth through institutional inheritance, the persistence of structural advantage across generations, these patterns are not simply historical. They are the patterns that shape the world you actually live in, the world in which some people are born with connections and advantages that are invisible to those who do not have them, and in which the official story consistently attributes the outcomes of those invisible advantages to the individual merit of those who have them. Understanding this is a form of seeing that matters not only for historical accuracy, but for practical engagement with the world. When you understand that the distribution of wealth and opportunity in the society you live in is not the natural outcome of neutral market processes, but the accumulated result of specific historical processes in which some groups had systematic advantages, you understand something important about the nature of the challenge that faces anyone who wants to change those distributions. The challenge is not simply to work harder or to be more meritorious within a system that is already operating fairly. The challenge is to change the system, to create the conditions under which the informal advantages of being inside the right networks are no longer the primary determinant of who succeeds and who does not. That is a much larger challenge than personal improvement, and it requires political rather than purely individual responses. Understanding this is not dispiriting, it is clarifying. It replaces a false story that generates frustration and self-blame. with an accurate story that generates a clearer sense of what needs to change and why. And clearer understanding, even of difficult things, is always more useful than comfortable illusion. That is the final lesson this long night has to offer. Now truly rest. The story has given what it can give tonight. What comes of it is yours to determine. Sleep well, dream of clarity, and wake to a world worth understanding honestly. Good night, truly and completely. And thank you for the time you have given to this telling. It was worth giving, and this story was worth telling, and the truth beneath it, imperfect and partial as all truths are, is worth carrying forward into whatever comes next. Good night. There is one more thing that wants to be said in the last breath of this telling. History is not finished with us. We carry it in the institutions we inhabit, in the social landscapes we move through, in the specific conditions of possibility and constraint that determine what is achievable for different people in the same society. The history of Sydney's founding families is one thread in that ongoing weaving, one set of decisions and consequences that continues to shape what is possible and what is not. Knowing the thread does not mean you can simply pull it out and replace it. Centuries of institutional development have woven it into the fabric so thoroughly that removing it would require dismantling the fabric itself, which is neither possible nor desirable in any simple way. But knowing the thread means you can see the fabric more accurately, can understand why it holds in some places and frays in others, can recognize which patterns in the weaving are structural and which are contingent, which are the result of the specific history we have been tracing, and which might be different if the history had been different. That kind of vision is what good history provides, and it is what tonight has tried to provide, imperfectly, as all vision is imperfect, but honestly as the evidence and the analysis allowed. Take the vision, it is yours now. Good night. The harbour holds everything tonight. The stories, the silences, the long weight of the history we have traced together. And now, finally, rest. Sleep. Dream.